The earliest beginnings of the Chola dynasty are hidden deep within the mist of early South Indian history, where archaeology, inscriptional evidence and literary tradition combine to offer glimpses of a people whose identity would eventually crystallize into one of the most powerful imperial lineages in Asia. The Cholas belong to the ancient Tamilakam, the geographical and cultural region that encompass present-day Tamil Nadu, parts of Kerala, Andhra and Sri Lanka. This was the land described in the Sangam poems, a landscape of bustling ports, fertile river valleys and dynastic rivalries. The Tamil country was home to three great crowned kings known collectively as the Moovendar, the Cholas, the Cheras and the Pandyas. Together they created a political and cultural rivalry that shaped early South Indian civilization for over a millennium. The Cholas themselves claim descent from a mythic ancestor named Chola, or in some traditions Sembian. The etymology of the name suggests a people connected to agriculture and settlement, firmly tied to the Kaveri River basin, which would later become the heartland of their state. The river was not just a geographical feature but a lifeline, creating fertile tracts of land that supported rice cultivation on a large scale. Early Chola power was inextricably linked to the mastery of these riverine resources. Inscriptions and copper plates discovered centuries later reveal how kings legitimized their rule through control of irrigation, the construction of tanks and canals, and the careful management of agrarian communities. These themes were already present in the earliest remembered stories of the Chola line. The Sangam literature, compiled between roughly 300 BCE and 300 CE, preserves poetic fragments that speak of Chola kings as warriors and patrons. They appear in bardic verses as figures who gave generously to poets, who fought with elephants and chariots, and who commanded armies that struck fear into rivals. Among these early rulers, Karikala Chola stands out as the most prominent. His name, often translated as the man with the charred leg, has come down through tradition as the archetype of the heroic king. The poets who sang of him associated his reign with victories over Cheras and Pandyas, with the construction of massive embankments along the Kaveri to control its floods, and with the gathering of tribute from far-flung lands. Whether these accounts are entirely factual or partly legendary matters less than the cultural memory they preserved. To the Tamil people, Karikala embodied the formative image of Chola kingship, one that would echo centuries later when Imperial Cholas invoked his legacy. Archaeological traces of the early Cholas remain fragmentary but significant. Sites in the Kaveri Delta have revealed megalithic burials, black and red ware pottery, and iron implements that date back to the early historic period. Together with Roman coins discovered in large numbers across Tamilakam, these finds testify to the existence of prosperous societies connected to international trade networks. The ports of Puhar, known to classical geographers as Kaviripattinam, became key nodes in this system. Ships from the Mediterranean, via the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, docked at Tamil ports to trade for pepper, pearls, cotton textiles, and gemstones. The Cholas, as rulers of this coast, gained wealth and prestige by controlling commerce, levying duties, and ensuring the safety of merchants. This maritime orientation, already visible in their earliest phase, foreshadowed the later imperial expansion across the Bay of Bengal. The political landscape of early Tamilakam was fluid, marked by shifting alliances, clan rivalries, and warfare that was celebrated in heroic poetry. Unlike the centralised monarchies of northern India, power in the Tamil south often rested on confederations of local chieftains bound by kinship and martial loyalty to greater kings. The Cholas were part of this network, at times rising above rivals, at times eclipsed by them. The constant theme across centuries was the struggle for dominance among the three crowned kings. Pandya inscriptions and Chera traditions equally preserve memories of conflicts where Cholas were either aggressors or victims. To reconstruct their early history requires weaving together such competing accounts, each with its own political bias. The religious life of the early Cholas is another field where cultural continuity is evident. Before the rise of temple-centered Shaivism and Vaishnavism in later centuries, Tamilakam was a land of ancient deities, fertility cults, and heroic worship. Local gods like Murugan were revered in hill shrines, while ancestor stones marked the resting places of warriors who had died in battle. Sangam poetry describes ritual feasts, sacrificial ceremonies, and festivals tied to seasonal cycles. The Chola rulers, as protectors of these traditions, derived part of their legitimacy from performing rituals that bound them to both the land and its people. In later centuries, Chola kings would present themselves as champions of Shiva and Vishnu, building vast temples that embodied their devotion, but these early foundations of ritual kingship were laid in the Sangam age. When classical authors from outside India wrote about the south, they sometimes reflected faint echoes of the Cholas. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek text from the 1st century CE, describes the land of the Chola as a place where merchants could obtain fine muslins, gems and ivory. Pliny the Elder, writing around the same time, spoke of Indian trade draining Roman gold. These testimonies, though fragmentary, align with Tamil literary references to bustling ports where Yavanas, or foreigners, came with their ships. The Cholas existed, therefore, not only as regional actors but as part of a global economic network that spanned continents. Their rise cannot be understood in isolation from these wider currents of exchange. The Kaveri Delta, with its rich alluvium and complex hydrology, was the physical core of early Chola power. Kings like Karikala are remembered for constructing the Grand Anikut, a massive dam that diverted the river's waters into irrigation channels. Though later reconstructions make it difficult to pinpoint the original scale, the persistence of this structure across centuries demonstrates the deep connection between Chola kingship and hydraulic engineering. Control of water meant control of food production, and thus control of wealth. Agricultural surpluses sustained courts, armies, and temples, while also supporting trade with distant lands. The Chola capacity to harness the Kaveri became one of their enduring strengths. Despite the grandeur of Karikala's memory, the Chola polity declined after the Sangam age. The rise of Pallavas in the north and Pandyas in the south pushed the Cholas into relative obscurity for several centuries. Their territory shrank, their power diminished, and only scattered references and inscriptions remind us of their existence. Yet this obscurity was temporary. Even in these centuries of eclipse, local Chola chieftains maintained their line, governing small tracts of the Kaveri Valley, preserving ancestral claims and waiting for an opportunity to reassert themselves. The persistence of the Chola identity through centuries of weakness is one of the remarkable features of their history. The cultural foundations laid in this early period endured. Tamil as a language of administration and literature continued to develop. The heroism of Sangam kings remained a point of reference for later rulers. Trade networks connecting Tamilakam to the wider Indian Ocean world survived political upheavals, ensuring that whoever controlled the ports could tap into lucrative commerce. Religious traditions too evolved but retained their deep roots in the land. When the Cholas would rise again in the 9th century under Vijayalaya, they did so upon a base already shaped by centuries of cultural memory. The story of the early Cholas is therefore one of emergence, florescence and eclipse, but never disappearance. From the megalithic burials of the Iron Age to the temples of the Pallava Age, the continuity of Tamil society provided a stage upon which the Cholas could eventually rebuild their power. By preserving their connection to the Kaveri, to Sangam traditions, and to the symbols of heroic kingship, they ensured that their name would not vanish. The embers of Karikala's legacy smouldered through centuries of obscurity until they were fanned into flame once again by ambitious rulers who claimed descent from him. That enduring sense of identity is what allowed the Cholas to transform from a Sangam dynasty into an imperial power. Their beginnings in ancient Tamilakam, therefore, should not be seen merely as prologue, but as the foundation of everything that followed. The memory of early kings, the development of ports like Kavarapattinam, the importance of irrigation and agriculture, and the cultural identity tied to Tamil literature all combined to create a bedrock. Upon this bedrock, the Cholas would later construct an empire that not only dominated South India, but reached far across the seas. The persistence of their name through inscriptions, poems, and oral tradition ensured that when revival came, it was framed not as the birth of something new, but as the restoration of something ancient and rightful. The Sangam Age stands as one of the most significant cultural and literary periods in the early history of Tamilakam, and it provides some of the clearest windows into the existence and activities of the earliest remembered Chola rulers. The Sangam poems, preserved through oral tradition and later codified into anthologies, are not dry chronicles but living testaments of the world in which these kings operated. Their verses are layered with descriptions of landscapes, battles, gifts, and personal virtues. They do not provide exact dates or genealogies in the way that later inscriptions would, but they capture a society in motion, alive with trade, war, love, and ritual. Within this vibrant corpus, the Cholas emerge as one of the crowned monarchies alongside the Cheras and Pandyas, their rulers praised by bards for generosity and condemned for cruelty when necessary. The references to the Cholas in the Sangam literature suggest that their territory was centred in the fertile plains watered by the Kaveri River. The river is not just a backdrop in these poems, but a constant motif, flowing through verses as the giver of life, the shaper of fields, and the stage for human activity. The Chola country, often described in the poems as Chola Nadu, appears as a landscape of rice paddies, coconut groves, and bustling towns, dotted with temples and markets. It was also a land of ports, with Puhar or Kavarapattinam appearing repeatedly as a hub of activity where ships docked and merchants from foreign lands unloaded their wares. The poems describe Yavana merchants, likely Greek and Roman traders, with their unfamiliar dress and manners, mingling in the Tamil ports. This interaction with the outside world was not a marginal feature, but a defining element of Chola prosperity, as foreign trade brought wealth and prestige to the kings who controlled it. Among the rulers named in Sangam poems, Karikala Chola is the most renowned. The verses surrounding him are rich with imagery of conquest and statecraft. He is described as leading armies of elephants and cavalry, defeating confederations of Chera and Pandya forces, and extending his authority across wide tracts of Tamilakam. One of the enduring images of Karikala is tied to his role as a builder, particularly his association with the construction of the Kalanai, the Grand Anicut across the Kaveri. While the historicity of every detail is debated by scholars, the symbolism is unmistakable. A ruler who tamed the river and harnessed its waters for agriculture was no ordinary king. He embodied the archetype of a sovereign whose power derived not only from military strength, but from stewardship of the land. To control water in an agrarian society was to command loyalty, tribute, and enduring fame. The poems also preserve accounts of Karikala's great battle at Veni, where he is said to have faced a coalition of Cheras and Pandya supported by minor chieftains. The verses describe the battlefield littered with bodies, the elephants charging through enemy lines, and the victory that cemented Karikala's supremacy. Another tradition speaks of his invasion of Sri Lanka, where he captured prisoners who were brought back to work on monumental irrigation projects. Whether these accounts are historical fact or poetic exaggeration, they reflect the image of a king whose reach extended beyond local boundaries and whose deeds were remembered for generations. Karikala was not the only Chola ruler remembered in Sangam texts. Kings such as Perunarkili are also named, sometimes in connection with the performance of grand rituals like the Vedic Rajasuya sacrifice, which symbolize sovereignty over other rulers. Such references indicate that the Cholas, while deeply embedded in Tamil cultural traditions, also connected themselves to the broader Indic world of ritual kingship. The Rajasuya was not just a religious act but a political declaration, asserting that the Chola ruler had the wealth, military support and ritual legitimacy to claim overlordship. That this sacrifice is attributed to a Chola king in the Sangam corpus underlines their prominence in the early centuries of the Common Era. The poets of the Sangam age played an essential role in shaping the image of these rulers. They were not merely artists, but intermediaries, linking kings with their subjects through praise and critique. A king's generosity toward poets was seen as proof of his greatness, for the verses would then immortalize him in song. A stingy or unjust ruler, by contrast, could expect to be lampooned, his failures remembered as warnings for posterity. The Cholas, like their rivals, maintained patronage of poets who then celebrated their victories, their gifts, their feasts, and their martial valour. Through these verses, the Chola entered a cultural memory that proved more enduring than many political arrangements. The Chola country described in these poems was not isolated. The mention of foreign merchants, Roman amphorae discovered in excavations, and hoards of Roman coins found in Tamilakam all corroborate the idea that the Chola rulers presided over a society connected to global trade networks. The Tamil ports traded spices, pearls, ivory and textiles for Roman gold and Mediterranean wine. This economic activity was so significant that Roman writers like Pliny complained of the drain of precious metals to India. The Cholas, situated on the fertile delta and controlling key ports, benefited immensely from this exchange. Their rulers, in turn, translated this wealth into displays of generosity and monumental works that reinforced their legitimacy. Religion during this period was marked by continuity and variety. The Chola rulers of the Sangam age appear as patrons of local deities, participants in Vedic sacrifices, and guardians of fertility cults. Temples in the monumental sense of later centuries were not yet the dominant institutions, but sacred groves, hero stones, and ritual feasts played central roles in community life. Kings were judged by their ability to protect these traditions, to sponsor rituals, and to embody the values of the land. In this sense, the Cholas of the Sangam age laid the groundwork for the synthesis of political power and religious patronage that would become so central to their imperial successors. The Sangam anthologies such as the Purana Nuru, Akam, and Etutokai are not uniform in their portrayal of the Cholas. They include laments over defeats, descriptions of battle losses, and criticisms of kings who failed their people. This makes them invaluable historical sources, for they preserve a complex picture rather than simple glorification. The Cholas are shown as human, vulnerable to reversals of fortune, caught in the same cycles of war, alliance, and betrayal that defined the politics of early Tamilakam. Yet even within this complexity, the name of the Cholas appears consistently, never fading entirely, always present as one of the crowned kings who mattered. Archaeological discoveries in Kavripattinam, identified with the ancient Chola port city of Puhar, add material depth to the literary record. Excavations have uncovered brick structures, wharves, and artifacts that match descriptions in Sangam poetry of a bustling port filled with warehouses, merchants, and sailors. The Tamil epic Silapati Karam, though composed later, situates much of its narrative in Puar, reinforcing its image as a cosmopolitan hub. The Chola rulers who presided over this port were therefore not only warriors, but also custodians of commerce, ensuring that the city thrived as a link between Tamilakam and the wider world. What emerges from these references is a portrait of the Cholas as an ancient dynasty deeply embedded in the cultural, economic and political currents of the Sangam age. They were kings who drew legitimacy from military victories, from their ability to control water and land, from their generosity to poets, and from their role as protectors of ritual traditions. Their names in poetry may not always match neatly with inscriptions or archaeological layers, but they preserve the memory of a dynasty that mattered in the imagination of the Tamil people. These early Chola rulers did not yet preside over empires or monumental temples, but they established a pattern of kingship that later Cholas would consciously invoke. The association with Karakala's embankments, with Perunakili's sacrifices, with Puhar's bustling markets, all of these became cultural touchstones that later rulers would claim as their inheritance. The Sangam references remind us that the Chola dynasty was not an invention of the medieval period, but a lineage with roots stretching back to the earliest remembered centuries of Tamil civilization. Even as political fortunes waxed and waned, even as rivals rose to prominence, the Cholas endured in cultural memory. Their early rulers, celebrated in song and remembered in legend, laid the first stones of a foundation that would much later support one of the most formidable empires of the Indian Ocean world. The threads of their story, woven into the fabric of Sangam poetry, ensured that when the Cholas returned to power centuries later, they did so not as newcomers, but as heirs to an ancient tradition already sanctified by verse and legend. Karakala Chola occupies a special place in the long continuum of South Indian history, a figure who bridges the world of heroic poetry and the realities of early state formation into Tamilakam. His story, woven out of Sangam verses, later Tamil epics, inscriptions, and centuries of cultural memory, is not always easy to separate into neat categories of fact and legend. Yet this blending of history and myth is precisely what gave Karakala his enduring power in the Tamil imagination. He was remembered as the archetype of the strong king, the ruler who defeated enemies in battle, who tamed the great Kaveri River, and who left behind works so monumental that later generations of Cholas could claim him as their ancestor with pride. To understand the foundations of Chola power, one must first walk carefully through the landscape of Karakala's reign, where poetry, politics and infrastructure intersected to produce a legacy that lasted long after his lifetime. The name Karakala itself has been the subject of interpretation. Some scholars suggest it derives from words meaning the man with the charred leg, pointing to a story in which he suffered burns as a youth but survived against all odds, an ordeal that symbolized resilience and divine favour. Others argue that the name may simply denote strength and power. Whatever its literal meaning, the epithet carried connotations of endurance, of a man who bore scars but turned them into symbols of legitimacy. In an age where rulers were constantly tested on the battlefield, the notion of a king marked by both suffering and triumph resonated deeply with Tamil cultural ideals. Karakala is most vividly remembered for his victory at Veni, a battle described in Sangam poetry with remarkable detail. At Veni he faced not a single rival, but a formidable alliance, the Cheras, the Pandyas, and a host of minor chieftains who had banded together to check Chola ambitions. The battlefield became the stage for a decisive assertion of Chola supremacy. The poems evoke images of elephants trampling enemy lines, of warriors clashing with spears and swords, of the earth soaked with blood as Karakala's forces gained the upper hand. The victory was not merely military but symbolic, demonstrating that the Cholas, despite periods of eclipse, remained capable of commanding loyalty, defeating coalitions and reasserting their place among the crowned kings of Tamilakam. The memory of Veni persisted for centuries, invoked by later Chola rulers as evidence of their lineage's valour and right to rule. Beyond the battlefield, Karakala's fame rests on his monumental engagement with the Kaveri River. The Kalanai, or Grand Anikut, attributed to him, is one of the oldest water diversion structures in the world that is still in use today. This massive dam, constructed across the Kaveri, near present-day Tiruchirappalli, was designed to regulate the river's flow and distribute water across the fertile delta. The project speaks volumes about the priorities of Karakala's reign. He recognised that control of water meant control of agriculture, and agriculture meant the foundation of wealth and political stability. By harnessing the river, he not only improved the prosperity of his subjects, but also reinforced his own image as a ruler who could bend nature itself to his will. The continued use of the Kalanai across 2 millennia is perhaps the greatest testimony to his foresight, an enduring monument that ties modern Tamil Nadu back to the age of the early Cholas. The stories of Karakala's achievements extend beyond Tamilakam. Several traditions recount his invasion of Sri Lanka, where he is said to have captured prisoners and brought them back to the Chola country as labour for his irrigation projects. Whether or not this campaign occurred in exactly the manner described, it reflects the ambition and reach attributed to him. It also foreshadows the later Chola maritime expeditions that would turn the Bay of Bengal into what historians have called a Chola lake. The memory of Karikala as a ruler whose authority touched distant shores provided a precedent for imperial aspirations centuries later. The Sangam poets, whose verses provide much of the surviving record of Karikala, depict him not only as a warrior and builder, but also as a generous patron. He rewarded poets lavishly, ensuring that their songs carried his name across the Tamil country and beyond. In a society where fame was transmitted orally, where memory was enshrined in verse rather than in stone inscriptions, the relationship between king and poet was critical. Karikala's reputation as a munificent ruler amplified his power, for a king celebrated in song became part of the cultural fabric in ways that no conquest alone could guarantee. The verses describe feasts in his court, elephants adorned with ornaments, and processions that displayed his wealth and majesty. Such imagery reinforced the idea that his rule brought prosperity not just for himself, but for the people who lived under his authority. Karikala's reign also appears to have marked an important stage in the integration of Tamilakam into the wider Indic world. References to Vedic rituals, such as the Rajasuya sacrifice performed by later Cholas, suggest that kings like Karikala were already aligning their authority with broader traditions of Dharmic kingship. This alignment did not erase the distinctiveness of Tamil culture, but rather layered it with additional legitimacy drawn from pan-Indian ideas of sovereignty. In this way, Karikala became both a Tamil hero and a ruler whose power resonated within larger frameworks of South Asian political thought. Material evidence that may be linked to Karikala's time adds further weight to his legacy. Excavations in the Kaveri Delta reveal a society with advanced iron tools, organised settlements, and extensive trade connections. Roman coins discovered in large numbers speak of vibrant overseas commerce, and literary references to Yavana traders docking at Chola ports match these finds. A ruler who secured these trade routes and protected the merchants would have gained not only wealth, but also international prestige. The Chola association with Puar, described as a cosmopolitan port filled with warehouses, markets, and foreign merchants, underlines the maritime dimension of their power. Karikala's fame as a conqueror and builder was therefore inseparable from his role as custodian of commerce, ensuring that the wealth of the seas flowed into the Kaveri basin. The blending of myth and history around Karikala illustrates the process by which dynastic memory was constructed in Tamilakam. Later Chola rulers, especially during the Great Imperial period beginning with Vijayalaya and culminating in Rajaraja and Rajendra, traced their lineage back to Karikala. They invoked his name in inscriptions, in temple dedications, and in political claims, situating themselves as heirs to his achievements. The fact that centuries separated his lifetime from theirs mattered little. What mattered was the continuity of memory, the idea that Chola kingship had ancient roots anchored in the heroic deeds of Karikala. This mytho-historical connection gave the imperial Cholas both legitimacy and a sense of destiny. Yet Karikala's story also contains notes of fragility. Sangam poems include laments and references to conflicts that remind us that his reign was not an era of uninterrupted triumph. Like all rulers of the period, he faced resistance, setbacks, and the constant uncertainty of a political landscape defined by shifting alliances. The very need for monumental victories like Veni and grand projects like the Kalanai suggest that his authority required constant reinforcement. Power in early Tamilakam was not absolute, but negotiated, contested, and often precarious. Karikala's success lay in his ability to assert dominance convincingly enough that his memory outlasted these challenges. The foundations of Chola power laid during Karikala's time were therefore multifaceted. Militarily, he demonstrated that the Cholas could defeat alliances of rivals and command respect. Economically, he ensured prosperity through irrigation and trade. Culturally, he secured immortality through their patronage of poets whose verses made him a household name. Symbolically, he established the archetype of the Chola king as both warrior and steward, a model that later rulers would consciously emulate. His reign did not create an empire in the sense of the later medieval Cholas, but it created the conditions and the memory that would make empire possible. When later poets and historians looked back, they saw in Caracalla the first great flowering of Chola power. His life became a touchstone, his deeds markers of what it meant to be a Chola king. The Grand Anicut stood as a visible reminder of his ability to command both men and nature, while the verses of Sangam bards preserved the memory of his battles and generosity. Together they formed a foundation that endured through centuries of obscurity and resurgence. The Cholas of the imperial age would rise and fall with monumental temples and fleets that reached across seas, but they always carried Caracalla's name as proof that their greatness was not new, that it had roots stretching back to the earlier centuries of Tamil civilization. The story of Caracalla is thus not merely about a single man, but about the construction of Chola identity. Through his victories, his works, and his patronage, he gave shape to what it meant to be a Chola ruler. His scarred leg, his embankments, his battlefield triumphs, and his generosity to poets combined into a narrative that transcended time. Even in the centuries when the Cholas faded from prominence, his memory lingered, waiting to be revived by descendants who would claim his mantle. It is in this sense that Caracalla Chola laid the foundations of Chola power, not by building an empire that lasted in his own lifetime, but by creating a model of kingship that would inspire the empire to come. The story of the Cholas after the heroic age of Caracalla does not move in an unbroken line of triumphs. Instead, it enters a long phase where their fortunes declined, their territory shrank, and their once prominent place in Tamalakam was overshadowed by the rising strength of other powers. This period of eclipse, stretching across several centuries, reveals how fragile early monarchies in South India could be. Even a dynasty with heroic memories and cultural prestige could find itself reduced to the status of minor chieftains when confronted by rivals who possessed better military organisation, stronger political alliances, or greater economic resources. For the Cholas, the centuries following the Sangam age became a time of survival rather than dominance, a time when their name persisted in memory and in occasional inscriptions, but rarely in the headlines of regional politics. The main rivals who cast their shadow across this period were the Pallavas and the Pandyas. The Pallavas, who rose to prominence in the 4th and 5th centuries, established their capital at Kanchipuram and steadily expanded their influence across northern Tamalakam. Their rise coincided with the decline of Satavahana power in the Deccan, and they benefited from controlling key trade routes that linked the Bay of Bengal with the interior of South India. The Pandyas, on the other hand, maintained their strength in the southernmost regions of Tamilakam, anchored in the fertile plains around Madurai. Between these two formidable powers, the Cholas found themselves caught in a squeeze. The land they had once dominated in the Kaveri Basin became contested, and their ability to project authority diminished. Evidence for the Cholas in this period becomes sparse, a stark contrast with the vibrant references of Sangam literature. Inscriptions from the Pallavas occasionally mention Cholas, but usually as defeated adversaries or subordinate allies. Copperplate grants from this time sometimes record Chola chiefs making donations, which suggests that while the dynasty had not disappeared, its rulers operated on a reduced scale, holding sway over small principalities rather than commanding the entire Kaveri Delta. This loss of political centrality meant that their role in shaping the grand currents of South Indian history temporarily waned. The Pallavas not only excelled in warfare but also in cultural patronage, and this further overshadowed the Cholas. The great monuments of Mahabalipuram and the temples of Kanchipuram stand as testimony to Pallava power and vision. The Cholas, by contrast, left little from this period that has survived archaeologically. Their cultural identity, preserved mainly in memory and oral tradition, could not compete with the visible, monumental architecture sponsored by Pallava kings like Mahendravarman and Narasimhavarman. To later generations, it was the Pallavas who defined Tamilakam during these centuries, while the Cholas lingered in the background. The Pandyas too presented a constant threat. Their ability to control pearl fisheries, maritime trade, and rich agricultural lands gave them resources that the diminished Cholas could not match. In Sangam literature, the Pandyas had already been celebrated as rivals of the Cholas, but in this later period, the balance tilted decisively in their favour. They expanded their influence into the southern portions of the Kaveri Delta and often came into conflict with the Pallavas for supremacy. In this triangular struggle, the Cholas lacked the military or economic strength to assert themselves. Despite this decline, the Cholas did not vanish. Genealogies preserved in later inscriptions suggest that local Chola chiefs continued to rule, in parts of the Delta, often as vassals of either the Pallavas or the Pandyas. These minor rulers maintained rituals, patronised temples in their small domains, and preserved the dynastic identity. Their survival during this long eclipse is remarkable, for many other minor dynasties of early Tamilakam simply disappeared without trace. The persistence of the Chola name suggests that they retained a sense of continuity, a belief in their heritage, and an ability to adapt to the shifting balance of power. Occasional flashes of resistance appear in the records. Some inscriptions from the Pallava period speak of battles against Chola chiefs who rose in rebellion. These episodes, though small in scale, reveal that the Cholas still harboured ambitions of independence. Their defeats in these encounters reinforced their subordination, but the very fact that they were remembered shows that the Pallavas considered them worthy of mention. The Cholas were not a forgotten lineage. They were a weakened one, waiting for circumstances to change. The decline of the Cholas also reflects the broader dynamics of South Indian history. Unlike the Gangetic Plain, where large empires could dominate for centuries, Tamilakam was characterised by constant flux. Geography, with its rivers, hills and coastlines, fragmented power. Trade, both inland and maritime, shifted routes as markets and demands changed. Dynasties rose and fell according to their ability to control these variables. For the Cholas, the centuries after Karikala represented the downside of this cycle, but the same dynamics would eventually allow them to rise again when new opportunities emerged. Religious and cultural developments during this period also helped prepare the ground for the eventual Chola resurgence. The Bhakti movement, with its passionate devotion to Shiva and Vishnu, began to flourish under Pallava patronage. The hymns of the Nayanmars and Alvars, composed in Tamil rather than Sanskrit, created a new devotional culture that spread across the region. The Cholas, though politically weak, were situated in the very heartland where this religious transformation took root. When they eventually regained power, they would align themselves with this movement, building great temples and sponsoring rituals that link their kingship to the gods of Bhakti. In this sense, the period of eclipse was not merely one of stagnation, but one of cultural preparation, laying foundations that the later Cholas would exploit fully. The shadow cast by the Pallavas and Pandyas was therefore both a curse and a context. It limited Chola power, forcing them into obscurity, but it also preserved them as a dynasty that endured through adversity. The memory of Karikala's embankments, of victories at Veni, and of prosperity in Puhar remained alive even when their current rulers were minor chieftains. This memory acted as a kind of cultural reservoir, waiting to be tapped when political fortune shifted. The persistence of the Chola name in inscriptions, however minor, ensured that when revival came, it could be framed as a restoration of ancient greatness, rather than the emergence of a new dynasty. The early decline of the Cholas thus illustrates the cyclical nature of power in South India. Dynasties could rise to dazzling heights and then sink into obscurity, only to rise again centuries later. The Pallavas and Pandyas dominated the stage during these centuries, building temples, leading armies and controlling trade, but the Cholas endured in the background. Their eclipse was long, their survival precarious, but they never vanished entirely. Their persistence through this shadowed age is what made possible the dramatic revival that would begin in the 9th century. when Vijayalaya Chola seized an opportunity to reclaim the Kaveri Delta. Without this long period of decline and endurance, the later Chola Empire would have had no ancient lineage to claim, no memory to restore, no cultural foundation upon which to build. The story of decline is therefore not simply a story of failure. It is a story of survival under unfavourable conditions, of maintaining identity in the face of overshadowing rivals, and of preserving the possibility of resurgence. In the shadow of the Pallavas and the Pandyas, the Cholas learned resilience, patience, and the importance of cultural continuity. These lessons, though invisible in the grand monuments of the time, would prove decisive when the wheel of fortune turned again in their favour. The revival of the Cholas in the 9th century stands as one of the most remarkable episodes in South Indian history, for it marked the transformation of a dynasty that had lingered in obscurity for centuries into a formidable power that would eventually dominate the Tamil country and far beyond. At the heart of this revival was Vijayalaya Chola, the ruler who seized a moment of political flux and turned it into the foundation of a renewed Chola state. His rise was not sudden in the sense of appearing out of nowhere. It was built upon the persistence of Chola identity through the long centuries of eclipse, the survival of minor chiefs who continued to claim descent from the old line, and the deep cultural memory of heroic kings like Karakala. What Vijayalaya accomplished was to channel these lingering legacies into a concrete political project, one that laid the groundwork for the empire that would emerge in the centuries to come. By the time Vijayalaya entered the stage, the political landscape of Tamilakam had been reshaped by the dominance of the Pallavas and the Pandyas. The Pallavas, centred in Kanchipuram, had built a reputation for military might and temple patronage, while the Pandyas of Madurai had entrenched themselves in the south. Yet both were beginning to show signs of vulnerability by the 9th century. The Pallavas faced challenges from the rising Rashtrakutas of the Deccan, whose powerful armies repeatedly pushed into northern Tamilakam. The Pandyas, though still strong, were embroiled in their own regional struggles. This created a space in which ambitious regional powers could manoeuvre, and Vijayalaya was uniquely positioned to exploit it. The sources that describe Vijayalaya's rise are a combination of inscriptions and later traditions. Inscriptions from the period record his conquest of Thanjavur, which would become the new Chola capital and the symbolic heart of their revival. Thanjavur's strategic location in the fertile Kaveri Delta made it an ideal centre for asserting authority. Control of this city meant control of rich agricultural lands, access to trade routes, and a base from which further expansion could be launched. By seizing Thanjavur, Vijayalaya transformed the Cholas from minor chiefs into serious contenders for regional power. The manner in which Vijayalaya took Thanjavur reflects the fluid and opportunistic nature of early medieval South Indian politics. The city was under the control of the Muttarayas, a local dynasty that had served as subordinates to the Pallavas. The decline of Pallava authority allowed Vijayalaya to challenge them, and his success in doing so marked a decisive shift in the balance of power. The Cholas, once overshadowed by Pallavas and Pandyas, now had a stronghold of their own in the very heart of the Kaveri Basin. From this point onward, their trajectory would be one of expansion and consolidation. The religious symbolism of Vijayalaya's actions also mattered deeply. After his conquest of Thanjavur, he is credited with constructing a temple to the goddess Durga, often referred to as Nisumba Sudani. This act was not only an expression of devotion, but a deliberate political statement. By associating his victory with the protection of a powerful goddess, Vijayalaya presented his conquest as divinely sanctioned. The temple became a symbol of the new Chola order, intertwining kingship with religious patronage in a way that would become a hallmark of later Chola rulers. This blending of political power and temple building created a durable form of legitimacy that resonated with the devotional culture of the time. The Bhakti movement, already flourishing under Pallava and Pandya patronage, provided fertile ground for Vijayalaya's strategy. By sponsoring temples and associating himself with deities, he tapped into a cultural wave that emphasized personal devotion divine grace, and the sanctity of temple worship. The hymns of the Nayanmars and Alvars, which had spread across Tamilakam, elevated temples as centres not only of religion, but of social and economic life. Vijayalaya's temple building therefore linked him with the dominant religious current of his age, ensuring that his revival of Chola power resonated deeply with the people. Politically, Vijayalaya's achievement was less about constructing a vast empire in his own lifetime than about creating a stable base from which his successors could expand. His reign marks the transition of the Cholas from minor players to a dynasty with the potential for imperial ambitions. The establishment of Thanjavur as the capital provided continuity and security. From there, his successors would embark on campaigns that extended Chola authority across Tamilakam, confronting both Pandyas and Pallavas, and eventually projecting power beyond the subcontinent. Without Vijayalaya's careful consolidation, none of this would have been possible. Economically, the choice of Thanjavur and the Kaveri Delta as the heartland was crucial. The delta's fertile soils, nourished by the river's irrigation, produced agricultural surpluses that could sustain armies, finance temple building, and support trade. The Cholas were thus rooted in one of the most productive agrarian regions of South India, giving them a structural advantage over rivals who relied more heavily on trade or less fertile territories. Vijayalaya's recognition of this potential shows his strategic foresight. The inscriptions that record Vijayalaya's achievements are also significant for what they reveal about Chola identity at this stage. They emphasize his lineage, linking him back to the ancient Cholas of the Sangam age. By doing so, they framed his conquest not as the rise of a new power, but as the restoration of an old dynasty to its rightful place. This claimed continuity was central to Chola legitimacy. Even after centuries of eclipse, the memory of Karikala and the early Chola still resonated strongly enough to be invoked effectively. Vijayalaya's success lay in presenting his revival as the fulfillment of a legacy, rather than a mere opportunistic conquest. The wider geopolitical context also played into his hands. The Pallavas, while still powerful, were increasingly distracted by Rashtrakuta invasions from the north. Their inability to defend all fronts allowed regional powers like the Cholas to assert themselves. The Pandyas, though formidable, could not prevent Vijayalaya from establishing his foothold in the central delta. In many ways, Vijayalaya's rise illustrates the principle that dynasties succeed as much through timing and circumstance as through personal ability. He seized the right opportunity at the right moment, and in doing so, altered the trajectory of South Indian history. Culturally, the revival under Vijayalaya marked the beginning of a new Chola identity, one that blended the heroic memories of the Sangam past with the devotional and temple-centered culture of the early medieval age. The Cholas of this period were no longer the semi-legendary figures of bardic poetry alone, but rulers who inscribed their deeds in copper plates, who endowed temples with land and wealth, and who presented themselves as protectors of both people and gods. This cultural synthesis gave them a legitimacy that endured, binding political authority to religious devotion in ways that resonated with society at large. The importance of Vijayalaya's revival cannot be overstated. Without his conquest of Thanjavur, his temple building, and his strategic consolidation, the later glories of Rajaraja and Rajendra would not have been possible. He provided the dynasty with a base, a vision, and a sense of restored destiny. His reign marks the turning point when the Cholas re-entered the stage of South Indian politics, not as shadows of the past, but as active players shaping the future. The revival was therefore not a single event, but the beginning of a process. Vijayalaya's achievements would be expanded upon by his son Aditya the Fair, who defeated the Pallavas and began the Chola expansion in earnest. Together they transformed the Cholas from survivors of eclipse into builders of empire. The 9th century thus stands as the dawn of the Chola imperial age, and Vijayalaya as the figure who lit the flame that would burn brightly for the next 400 years. Aditya the Fair, the son and successor of Vijayalaya, carried forward the momentum of Chola revival and transformed what had been a tentative foothold into a decisive assertion of regional power. If Vijayalaya was the restorer who reclaimed dignity for a dynasty long overshadowed, Aditya was the builder who consolidated those gains and announced to the Tamil world that the Cholas were no longer a minor principality, struggling to survive but a force capable of dismantling old hegemonies. His reign in the late 9th century marked the end of Pallava dominance in northern Tamilakam and set the stage for the Cholas to emerge as the most formidable power in the south. When Aditya came to the throne, the political situation remained precarious. The Pallavas were weakened by repeated conflicts with the Rashtrakutas and internal struggles, but they were not yet irrelevant. They still commanded respect as patrons of art and architecture, and their capital at Kanchipuram retained symbolic prestige. The Pandyas continued to assert themselves in the south, and the Rashtrakutas, though based in the Deccan, frequently projected power into Tamilakam. For a Chola ruler in this environment, survival alone would have been an achievement. Yet Aditya not only survived but also struck decisively against the Pallavas, overturning the balance of power in the region. The critical moment of Aditya's reign came with his victory over Aparajita Pallava, the last significant Pallava king. This battle, fought near Kanchipuram around the year 897 CE, was a turning point in South Indian history. Aditya allied himself with Krishna II of the Rashtrakutas, who also sought to curtail Pallava power. Together they confronted Aparajita, and in the clash that followed, Aditya is said to have killed the Pallava king himself. This act carried both military and symbolic weight. Militarily, it removed the Pallavas as serious contenders for dominance in Tamilakam. Symbolically, it placed Aditya in the role of dynastic avenger, striking down a line that had for centuries overshadowed the Cholas. The death of Aparajita marked the effective end of Pallava power, reducing their legacy to temples and inscriptions, but removing them from the political future of the region. Aditya's victory was not a simple matter of battlefield triumph, but the culmination of careful strategy. His alliance with the Rashtrakutas illustrates his diplomatic acumen. He understood that the Cholas, newly revived, could not defeat the Pallavas alone, but by aligning with a powerful northern dynasty, he could tilt the balance. At the same time, this alliance was temporary and opportunistic. Once the Pallavas were destroyed, the Cholas would inevitably come into their own, no longer needing to depend on Rashtrakuta support. This pragmatic use of alliances became a recurring feature of Chola politics, allowing them to grow steadily without overextending themselves prematurely. The conquest of Pallava territory brought the Cholas not only prestige but also tangible resources. Northern Tamilakam, with its fertile lands and important urban centres, now came under Chola control. The capture of Kanchipuram, long a centre of learning and religion, added symbolic weight to their authority. The Cholas, who had endured centuries in the shadows, now presided over the city that had once epitomised Pallava grandeur. This was more than territorial expansion, it was a transfer of cultural legitimacy. By ruling from Thanjavur but holding Kanchipuram, Aditya positioned the Cholas as heirs to the Pallava tradition even as they surpassed it. Aditya's reign also saw the strengthening of ties between kingship and temple patronage. Inscriptions record his endowments to temples, particularly to Shiva shrines. By presenting himself as a devotee and protector of the gods, Aditya aligned himself with the Bhakti movement that had taken deep root in Tamilakam. This was not mere piety, but a political strategy. Temples were not only religious centres, but also economic and social hubs. By patronising them, the king wove his authority into the fabric of everyday life, ensuring that loyalty to the dynasty was reinforced through devotion to the deities they supported. The association between the Cholas and Shaivism, which would reach monumental proportions under Rajaraja and Rajendra, had its early articulation in the reign of Aditya V. The consolidation of Chola power under Aditya is also reflected in the administrative measures attributed to his time. Copperplate grants from his reign reveal a pattern of land donations to Brahmins, which not only reinforced his image as a dharmic king but also created a network of loyal supporters across his territories. These land grants often resulted in the establishment of Brahmadeya villages, which became centres of agrarian expansion and cultural transmission. By intertwining political power with religious and agrarian institutions, Aditya laid down structures that would sustain the Chola Empire for centuries. It is worth noting that Aditya's success did not mean the immediate disappearance of all rivals. The Pandyas remained active in the south, and the Rashtrakutas continued to intervene in southern politics. Yet the removal of the Pallavas fundamentally altered the regional balance. For the first time in centuries, the Cholas faced no serious rival in the central and northern portions of Tamilakam. This gave them a secure base from which to confront other powers. Aditya himself may not have extended his rule deep into Pandya territory, but he created the conditions under which his successors could attempt such expansion. The memory of Aditya's reign persisted in Chola tradition, not only because of his military achievements, but also because of the way he embodied the new identity of the dynasty. He was not merely a conqueror, but a consolidator. His rule demonstrated that the Cholas could blend military prowess with religious devotion, strategic alliances with cultural patronage, and opportunism with long-term planning. This synthesis became the hallmark of Chola imperial policy in the centuries to follow. The defeat of the Pallavas also carried psychological weight. For generations, the Pallavas had been the towering rivals whose power defined Tamilakam. They had built great temples, defeated enemies, and held sway over large territories. For the Cholas to defeat them and absorb their lands was to overturn the political order itself. It marked the moment when the Cholas ceased to be a dynasty of revival and became a dynasty of ascendancy. From this point forward, their trajectory was one of expansion, innovation, and the construction of a legacy that would echo across South and Southeast Asia. Aditya's reign therefore represents more than a transitional phase. It was the decisive step in the Chola journey from obscurity to dominance. By defeating the Pallavas, consolidating the delta, patronizing temples, and creating structures of governance, he ensured that the Cholas would not slip back into eclipse. He passed on to his successors not only a stronger kingdom, but also a new identity, an identity that looked back to the heroic past of Karikala and Vijayalaya, but also forward to the imperial grandeur of Rajaraja and Rajendra. The rise of Aditya was thus the moment when the Cholas truly re-entered the centre of South Indian history. The shadow of the Pallavas, which had loomed for centuries, was finally lifted. In its place stood a dynasty newly confident of its destiny, rooted in the fertile lands of the Kaveri, enriched by temples and trade, and prepared to embark on a path that would lead to the creation of one of the greatest empires in Asian history. Prantakakyam, the son of Aditya I, carried the Chola dynasty into a new phase of expansion and consolidation, transforming the gains of his father into the foundations of a kingdom that stretched further than any Chola ruler before him. If Vijayalaya had been the restorer and Aditya the conqueror of the Pallavas, then Prantaka was the architect of Chola supremacy in the Tamil country. His reign, which lasted for nearly half a century beginning around 907 CE, was marked by military campaigns, ambitious expansion into Pandya territory, and a deepening of the connection between kingship, religion, and administration. By the end of his rule, the Cholas had ceased to be merely one of several Tamil dynasties and had become the dominant power of the south, a position that would shape the trajectory of the dynasty for generations. When Prantaka ascended the throne, the Cholas were already in a stronger position than they had been in centuries. The defeat of the Pallavas under Aditya had removed a long-standing obstacle, leaving the Pandyas as the primary rivals in Tamilakam. The Pandyas, centred at Madurai, controlled rich agricultural lands and lucrative pearl fisheries along the Gulf of Mannar. They had long been one of the three-crowned monarchies of the Tamil land, and their prestige matched their wealth. For the Cholas to assert themselves fully in the south, they had to confront the Pandyas directly. Prantaka recognised this reality, and embarked on campaigns that would bring large portions of Pandya territory under Chola authority. The most significant of these campaigns culminated in the capture of Madurai, the Pandya capital. Inscriptions and copper plate grants proudly record that Parantaka assumed the title Madurayum Ilamum Konda Parakasariva Man, meaning the Parakasari who conquered Madurai and Ilam, Sri Lanka. The conquest of Madurai was no small feat. It symbolised not only the defeat of a rival dynasty, but also the capture of a city steeped in cultural and religious significance. Madurai had long been celebrated in Tamil literature as the seat of learning and the home of the Tamil Sangam tradition. For the Cholas to hold it was to assert themselves as heirs to that cultural prestige as well as political authority. Parantaka's campaigns also extended to Sri Lanka, though with mixed results. He claimed to have conquered Ilam, and Chola inscriptions boast of victories there. Yet the control of the island was tenuous at best during his reign, more in the form of raids and temporary occupations than long-term administration. Nevertheless, the very fact that Parantaka directed his attention beyond the mainland reflects the expanding horizons of Chola ambition. The dynasty was beginning to think not merely in terms of Tamilakam, but of a wider sphere of influence, a vision that would later culminate in the overseas expeditions of Rajendra Chola. Within Tamilakam, the annexation of Pandya territory had profound consequences. It brought vast new resources under Chola control, from fertile fields to coastal fisheries. It also positioned the Cholas as overlords of a region that had once been the pride of their rivals. This expansion was reflected in Parantaka's titles, which emphasized his conquests and presented him as the supreme ruler of the Tamil land. His authority was further reinforced through temple patronage. Parantaka is remembered as a generous donor who covered the Chidambaram temple's roof with gold, an act that not only displayed his wealth, but also tied his kingship to the favour of Lord Shiva, one of the most revered deities of the Bhakti tradition. The glittering roof of Chidambaram became a visible symbol of Chola magnificence, proclaiming to all who entered the temple that the Chola king was both powerful and pious. The reign of Parantaka also saw the continuation and expansion of administrative practices that strengthened Chola rule. Copper plate inscriptions from his time record detailed grants of land to Brahmins and temples, with careful specifications about boundaries, taxes, and obligations. These documents reveal an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, one that combined royal authority with local assemblies and religious institutions. Parantaka's rule thus marked a further integration of political power with the social and economic life of the kingdom. Villages, organised into assemblies such as the Sabha and the Yur, played a crucial role in implementing royal directives, collecting taxes and managing resources. By embedding royal authority within these local structures, the Cholas ensured stability and continuity. Despite his successes, Parantaka's reign was not without challenges. The Pandyas, though weakened, were not entirely subdued. They sought support from the rising power of the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan, and this alliance would prove disastrous for the Cholas later in his reign. The Rashtrakutas, one of the most formidable dynasties of the time, intervened in Tamilakam and inflicted a severe defeat on Parantaka at the Battle of Takolam around 949 CE. This battle, fought against Krishna III of the Rashtrakutas, marked a turning point. The Cholas, who had seemed invincible after their victories over the Pallavas and Pandyas, now faced a humiliating setback. The defeat at Takolam curtailed further expansion, checked Chola ambitions in the northern regions, and forced Parantaka to consolidate rather than extend his authority in the latter part of his reign. Yet even in the face of this setback, the overall significance of Parantaka's rule remains clear. He had expanded Chola authority further than any ruler since Karikala, bringing Madurai under his control and projecting power into Sri Lanka. He had strengthened the connection between Chola kingship and temple patronage, leaving enduring legacies like the golden roof of Chidambaram. He had refined the administrative structures that allowed the Cholas to govern effectively over large territories, and he had positioned the dynasty firmly as the dominant power in the Tamil south, even if their ambitions in the north were checked by Rashtrakuta might. Culturally, Parantaka's reign reinforced the Chola identity as both conquerors and devotees. His patronage of temples, his assumption of grand titles, and his integration of local assemblies into royal governance all contributed to a model of kingship that was both powerful and accessible. The Chola king was not a distant figure ruling only through armies. He was a presence in the daily religious, economic, and administrative life of his people. This integration ensured that the Chola state was more resilient than many of its rivals, capable of absorbing setbacks without collapsing. Parantaka's long reign also meant that a generation grew up knowing only Chola dominance. For nearly 50 years, the Cholas were the defining power in Tamilakam, and this longevity cemented their legitimacy. When later Chola rulers faced challenges, they could look back to Parantaka's example as proof that their dynasty had the capacity to rule, expand, and endure. The defeats he suffered at the hands of the Rashtrakutas were setbacks, but they did not erase the broader achievements of his reign. The expansion into Pandya territories under Parantaka was therefore a decisive chapter in Chola history. It demonstrated the dynasty's ability to defeat rivals, incorporate new lands, and link political power to cultural and religious legitimacy. It also revealed the challenges of maintaining dominance in a landscape where powerful neighbours like the Rashtrakutas could intervene. Yet the overall trajectory remained one of growth. By the time of his death, the Cholas had moved far beyond the fragile revival of Vijayalaya. They had become the dominant power in southern Tamilakam, with ambitions that stretched across the Palk Strait and aspirations that looked toward the entire Indian Ocean. Parantaka's reign thus stands as a pivotal moment, a reign of both triumph and trial. His victories over the Pandyas and his cultural patronage laid the groundwork for the imperial Cholas, while his defeat at Takolam served as a reminder of the limits of power in a contested world. Together, these experiences shaped the Chola dynasty into a resilient, ambitious and adaptive force, ready to rise again in even greater glory under the rulers who would follow. The later years of Parantaka and the decades that followed brought the Chola dynasty into one of its most difficult phases since the time of their early decline. The crisis that unfolded was not a complete collapse, but it shook the foundations of their hard-won supremacy and revealed how vulnerable even the most ambitious rulers could be in the face of powerful northern adversaries. The Rashtrakutas, rising from their Deccan stronghold, became the most formidable threat the Cholas had yet encountered. Their repeated incursions into the Tamil country, combined with internal struggles within the Chola house, brought defeats that dimmed the lustre of earlier conquests. For nearly half a century after the death of Parantaka, the Cholas endured a period of turbulence where survival again became the pressing concern, and it was uncertain whether the dynasty would ever recover its earlier dominance. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Takolam around 949 CE. This confrontation pitted the Cholas under Rajendra, the heir of Parantaka, against Krishna III of the Rashtrakutas, one of the most powerful monarchs of his age. The Rashtrakutas, based in Manyaketa, had already established themselves as the paramount power of the Deccan, projecting their influence southward into Tamilakam. Their armies were large, disciplined, and accustomed to warfare across diverse terrains. At Takolam, the Cholas faced this might head-on, defending the gains that Parantaka had made in the Pandya country, and hoping to check northern encroachment. The battle, however, turned into a disaster for the Cholas. Rajendra was killed on the field, struck by an arrow while fighting from atop his elephant. His death sent shockwaves through the Chola ranks, and the Rashtrakutas claimed victory, pushing deep into Chola territory. The defeat at Takolam had far-reaching consequences. It was not merely the loss of a battle, but the shattering of Chola prestige. The Rashtrakutas overran large portions of northern Tamilakam, reasserted control over the Pallava remnants, and humbled the Cholas who only a generation earlier had proclaimed themselves conquerors of Madurai and Lanka. Krishna III assumed grand titles boasting of his victory, and his inscriptions recorded the humiliation of the Cholas. For the dynasty that had so recently seemed unstoppable, the setback was devastating. The loss of Rajaditya also created a succession crisis, weakening the continuity of leadership just as external threats loomed. The years that followed were marked by instability within the Chola court. Parantaka's successors struggled to maintain cohesion, and rival claimants competed for authority. Inscriptions from this period are fewer and more fragmented, reflecting the weakened state of the dynasty. Local chieftains who'd been subdued under Parantaka began to assert themselves again, sensing the vulnerability of their overlords. The Pandyas, though earlier subdued, revived their claims to independence with Rashtrakuta backing. The once stable dominance of the Cholas fractured, and their influence contracted back toward the Kaveri Delta, the ancestral heartland that had always served as their refuge in times of difficulty. The Rashtrakutas, for their part, pressed their advantage. Krishna III extended his influence not only into Tamilakam but also into Lanka, claiming suzerainty over regions that the Cholas had once sought to dominate. His victories were celebrated in inscriptions and praised in northern courts, while the Cholas endured a reputation of defeat. Yet even as they suffered, the dynasty did not collapse. This resilience was rooted in the structures that Parantaka and his predecessors had built: the strong agrarian base of the Kaveri, the loyalty of local assemblies that administered resources, and the cultural legitimacy that tied Chola kingship to temples and traditions. These foundations ensured that even when Chola armies faltered, the dynasty itself endured. The crisis of this period also illustrates the limits of expansion in a world of shifting alliances and powerful neighbours. The Cholas had risen rapidly by exploiting the weakness of the Pallavas and seizing Pandya lands, but the Rashtrakutas represented a different scale of challenge. They were not a Tamil dynasty vulnerable to the same cycles of local conflict, but a Deccan empire with resources that dwarfed those of individual southern kingdoms. Their intervention in Tamilakam was not an occasional raid, but a sustained campaign to assert dominance. For the Cholas, confronting such power required time, adaptation, and the patience to endure reverses until circumstances shifted. One of the enduring legacies of this crisis was the sharpening of Chola identity. In the face of defeat, inscriptions and traditions began to emphasize continuity and resilience. Later rulers traced their lineage carefully, reminding subjects that despite setbacks, they were heirs to Karakala, to Vijayalaya, to Aditya, and to Parantaka. This invocation of the past provided a psychological anchor during uncertain times. It assured both the dynasty and its people that defeat was temporary, that decline did not mean disappearance, and that resurgence was always possible. The cultural life of the Chola country also persisted despite political turmoil. Temples continued to function, assemblies continued to manage agrarian affairs, and poets continued to compose verses. The Rashtrakuta invasions disrupted political control but did not erase the underlying vitality of Tamil society. In fact, the Bhakti movement deepened its roots during this period, with devotional hymns to Shiva and Vishnu spreading widely. This religious energy would later become a powerful resource for the Cholas when they revived, allowing them to link their kingship even more firmly with divine favour. The decline after Takolam extended through the reigns of Parantaka's successors, including Gandaraditya and Arinjaya, who ruled for short and relatively uneventful periods. Their inscriptions speak more of temple donations and pious acts than of conquests, reflecting a dynasty in retreat, focused on survival rather than expansion. It was not until Sundara Chola and his son Arulmojivarman, later celebrated as Rajarajathursan, that the Cholas began to recover fully. In this sense, the crisis of the Rashtrakuta invasions forms the dark valley between the early ascendancy of Parantaka and the imperial grandeur of the later Cholas. The Rashtrakutas themselves eventually declined, as all dynasties do, undermined by internal weaknesses and the rise of new powers in the Deccan. Their fall created the space in which the Cholas could reassert themselves, but during the mid-10th century they stood as the dominant force in southern India, and the Cholas bore the brunt of their might. The defeats the Cholas suffered under their shadow were real and humiliating, yet they became part of the larger rhythm of rise and fall that defined Tamil history. The Chola crisis during the Rashtrakuta invasions is therefore best understood not as an interruption of their destiny, but as a crucible. It tested the dynasty's ability to endure, to preserve identity through adversity, and to prepare for renewal. The defeats at Takolam and elsewhere stripped away illusions of invincibility, but left intact the deeper structures of Chola society. From those structures would rise a new phase of power, one that far surpassed anything the dynasty had achieved before. What seemed in the mid-10th century like a nadir, defeats on the battlefield, loss of territories, humiliation at the hands of Rashtrakutas, was in retrospect a necessary interlude. It was during this time that the Cholas consolidated their base, learned from their setbacks, and positioned themselves for the resurgence that would come under Rajaraja I. The crisis did not destroy them, it tempered them. In the shadows of Rashtrakuta triumphs, the Cholas prepared for the imperial age that was yet to dawn. The emergence of Rajaraja I at the turn of the 11th century marks one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of South India. For generations, the Cholas had been remembered as a dynasty that had risen under Vijayalaya, expanded under Aditya and Parantaka, but then faltered under the pressure of Rashtrakuta invasions and internal weakness. Their name endured, their lineage persisted, yet for decades their fortune seemed uncertain, their power checked, their ambitions thwarted. Into this fragile legacy stepped Arulmoji Varman, later crowned as Rajaraja I, a figure whose reign would not only restore Chola prestige, but elevate it to heights that surpassed anything in their earlier history. His reign between 985 and 1014 CE is rightly described as a renaissance, a rebirth of Chola power, culture, and identity that turned the dynasty into one of the greatest empires of Asia. The man who had become Rajaraja was born in a period still overshadowed by crisis. His father Sundara Chola had sought to stabilize the kingdom after the defeats of earlier decades, but the dynasty remained vulnerable to rivals. The Pandyas were resurgent, supported by Sri Lankan rulers who sought to keep the Cholas in check. The Cheras of Kerala presented another rival power on the western coast. In the Deccan, the Rashtrakutas were fading, but their successors, the Western Chalukyas, emerged as new and formidable adversaries. Against this background of constant threat, Arulmoji Varman had to prove himself first as a prince, gaining military experience and demonstrating his ability to command loyalty, before he could step into the role of supreme ruler. Even as a young prince, he showed remarkable military skill. Sources describe his campaigns in Sri Lanka before he was crowned, where he led expeditions that gained Chola footholds on the island. These early ventures foreshadowed his later ambitions, demonstrating his recognition that Chola destiny was tied not only to control of the Tamil mainland, but also to influence across the seas. His ability to command successful campaigns, while still a subordinate prince, won him respect among the nobility and the army, smoothing his eventual accession to the throne. When he became king in 985 CE, Rajaraja faced a complex political landscape that demanded both consolidation and expansion. His first priority was to assert control firmly within Tamilakam. He launched campaigns that subdued the Pandyas, bringing their territories under Chola dominance and neutralizing a rival that had long been a thorn in Chola ambitions. He also turned his attention to Kerala, defeating the Cheras and extending Chola influence into regions that had previously resisted their authority. Through these campaigns, Rajaraja secured the western coast and gained access to valuable ports that enriched the Chola economy and positioned them for wider maritime activity. Rajaraja's conquests were not limited to the Tamil country. He expanded northward, confronting the western Chalukyas and pushing Chola influence into the Deccan. His campaigns reached as far as the Tungabhadra River, bringing vast territories under Chola control or influence. In doing so, He ensured that the Cholas were no longer confined to Tamilakam, but had become a force to be reckoned with in peninsular India as a whole. The inscriptions of his reign proudly list the kings he defeated and the lands he annexed, projecting an image of a monarch whose power extended in all directions. Equally significant was Rajaraja's overseas ambition. He launched major expeditions to Sri Lanka, eventually conquering the northern part of the island and incorporating it into the Chola realm. This marked the beginning of a long period of Chola involvement in Sri Lankan affairs, one that would shape both the island's history and the Chola Empire's trajectory. By asserting control over Sri Lanka, Rajaraja not only subdued a traditional ally of the Pandyas, but also secured a strategic base for maritime activities across the Bay of Bengal. His campaigns thus reflect a recognition that Chola power would be incomplete if it remained confined to the mainland. Military expansion was only one dimension of Rajaraja's renaissance. Equally important was his cultural and religious patronage, which gave the Chola state a grandeur that extended beyond the battlefield. His most enduring legacy in this realm is the Brihadeeswarar Temple at Thanjavur, a monument that still towers over the Tamil landscape. Constructed in the early 11th century, this temple epitomizes the synthesis of religion, art, and kingship that defined Chola power. Dedicated to Lord Shiva, it symbolized both Rajaraja's devotion and his claim to divine sanction. Its scale, with a towering vimana that rises over 200 feet, projected Chola might in stone, proclaiming to all who saw it that the dynasty had entered a new age of imperial grandeur. The temple was not only a religious monument but also an administrative and cultural centre. Inscriptions carved into its walls record detailed grants of land, jewels and resources to the temple, creating a vast economic base that supported priests, dancers, musicians and artisans. These inscriptions provide some of the most detailed records of Chola society, revealing the intricacies of taxation, administration and social organisation. By channeling resources into the temple, Rajaraja created an institution that anchored Chola power in the spiritual and economic life of the people. The temple was both a house of the divine and a statement of imperial ideology. Rajaraja's reign also witnessed the expansion of Chola administration. He organised his empire into provinces, districts, and villages, with appointed officials overseeing local assemblies. The use of extensive inscriptions to record land grants, tax remissions, and temple endowments reflects a bureaucratic sophistication that ensured effective governance. The integration of local assemblies into this framework meant that royal authority was not imposed from above alone, but worked in tandem with community institutions. This system gave the Chola Empire resilience and efficiency, enabling it to sustain itself over vast territories. Culturally, the Chola Renaissance under Rajaraja was marked by the flowering of Tamil literature, sculpture, and bronze casting. The period saw the creation of exquisite bronze images of deities such as Nataraja, which combined artistic mastery with spiritual symbolism. These bronzes, many commissioned during or after Rajaraja's reign, remain among the greatest artistic achievements of South Asia. They embody the synthesis of devotion and artistry that characterized Chola culture, projecting an image of the divine that was both accessible and transcendent. Literature, too, thrived, with Tamil devotional hymns being codified and preserved, ensuring that the Bhakti tradition became central to Tamil religious life. Rajaraja also extended Chola influence into the wider Indian Ocean world through diplomacy and trade. He established relations with Southeast Asian kingdoms, such as the Srivijaya Empire, and supported merchants engaged in maritime commerce. The Chola ports buzzed with activity, handling goods from across Asia, including spices, textiles, and precious metals. This integration into global trade networks enriched the Chola economy and reinforced the image of the king as a ruler whose influence reached beyond India's shores. What distinguished Rajaraja was not only the scope of his achievements, but also the way he synthesized military, cultural, and administrative strategies into a coherent vision of kingship. He did not rely on conquest alone to project authority. He combined it with temple building, with bureaucratic innovation, with the cultivation of devotion and artistry. His reign thus marks a renaissance not only in Chola political power, but in Tamil civilization as a whole. He transformed the Cholas from regional rulers into imperial monarchs whose name carried weight across India and the Indian Ocean. By the time of his death in 1014 CE, Rajendra had reshaped the destiny of his dynasty. He left to his son, Rajendra I, an empire that was vast, prosperous, and culturally resplendent. The crisis of the Rashtrakuta invasions and the uncertainties of the mid-10th century were now distant memories, overshadowed by the grandeur of his accomplishments. The Cholas had entered their golden age, and Rajaraja's reign had been the spark that ignited it. His legacy lived on not only in the monuments he built and the lands he conquered, but in the very identity of the Chola dynasty, which from this point forward would be remembered as one of the greatest imperial powers in Indian history. The emergence of Rajaraja Thrmi and the Renaissance he ushered in was thus more than a chapter in dynastic history. It was the rebirth of a civilization, the moment when the Cholas claimed their place as architects of empire, patrons of art, and custodians of a cultural tradition that would endure for centuries. Rajaraja's reign cannot be understood without tracing in detail the military campaigns that allowed him to consolidate the foundations of the Chola Empire. His greatness did not rest solely on monumental architecture or temple patronage, though these were crucial, but on the hard edge of conquest, the steady expansion of frontiers, and the careful subjugation of rivals. The Cholas before him had suffered defeats and periods of obscurity. Rajaraja made certain that his dynasty would never again be relegated to the margins of history. Through calculated campaigns across Tamilakam, the Deccan, Sri Lanka, and even into the Indian Ocean, he forged an empire whose strength was recognized both in India and abroad. His military successes provided the material base upon which the cultural and religious achievements of his reign could be built, binding together political ambition and civilizational grandeur. Rajaraja's first priorities lay within the Tamil country itself. Upon his accession in 985 CE, he inherited a realm that had been strengthened by his father Sundara Chola, but was still contested by traditional rivals. The Pandyas remained a source of unrest, claiming independence and at times allying with Sri Lankan rulers. The Cholas of Kerala continued to assert their influence on the western coast, controlling important ports and trade routes. Rajaraja recognized that he could not build a lasting empire until these rivals were decisively subdued. He therefore embarked on campaigns designed to bring all of Tamilakam firmly under Chola dominance. The confrontation with the Pandyas was among his earliest and most important military ventures. The Pandyas had long prided themselves on their independence, their capital at Madurai serving as both political and cultural hub. Rajaraja's campaign against them was relentless. Inscriptions record his victories and his assumption of titles, proclaiming him conqueror of the Pandya land. Madurai fell under Chola control, and with it came the incorporation of the rich agricultural hinterlands and the lucrative pearl fisheries along the southern coast. By subduing the Pandyas, Rajaraja removed one of the most persistent sources of resistance to Chola supremacy, and demonstrated that his authority reached into the deepest south of Tamilakam. From the south, he turned his attention to the west, where the Cholas controlled Kerala and its maritime outlets. The Chera kingdom had long been a thorn in the side of Chola ambitions, their territory providing both fertile land and strategic access to trade with the Arabian Sea. Rajaraja's campaigns pushed into these lands, defeating the Chera king Bhaskara Ravivarman and asserting Chola authority over important regions. His control of parts of Kerala opened up Chola access to west coast ports, integrating the empire more fully into the wider Indian Ocean trade system. By bringing both the Pandyas and Cholas under subjugation, Rajaraja effectively ended the centuries-old rivalry among the three crowned kings of Tamilakam. The Cholas now stood supreme within their ancestral homeland. But Rajaraja's ambitions did not stop at the boundaries of Tamilakam. He recognised that true imperial authority required expansion into the Deccan and across the seas. Northward, his armies confronted the western Chalukyas, who had succeeded the Rashtrakutas as the dominant power of the Deccan. The Chalukyas, centred in the Tungabhadra region, posed a formidable challenge. Rajaraja launched multiple campaigns against them, securing victories that extended Chola influence deep into their territory. His inscriptions boast of conquests in Nolamba country and victories along the Tungabhadra. These campaigns did not result in permanent annexation of all Chalukya lands, but they asserted Chola power in the Deccan and established a frontier that his successors would continue to defend and expand. Rajaraja also understood the strategic importance of Lanka. For centuries the island had been both a rival and a prize, often aligned with the Pandyas against Chola interests. Rajaraja launched a massive expedition to Sri Lanka, invading from the north and eventually conquering the kingdom of Anuradhapura. His forces captured the city, destroyed its monuments, and carried back immense wealth. He established Chola control over the northern part of the island, integrating it into his empire. This conquest was more than symbolic. It secured control over sea routes in the Bay of Bengal, denied the Pandyas a powerful ally, and provided the Cholas with a base for future maritime expeditions. Chola inscriptions proudly record the conquest of Lanka as one of the great triumphs of Rajaraja's reign, cementing his reputation as a ruler whose power extended beyond the mainland. Beyond the Deccan and Sri Lanka, Rajaraja's influence touched the wider Indian Ocean world. His fleets and merchants interacted with Southeast Asia, and though his son Rajendra would take these ventures further, the groundwork was laid under Rajaraja. The mere fact that the Chola Empire could project naval power across the seas was extraordinary for its time, and it reflected the combination of military might and economic resources that Rajaraja commanded. His campaigns, therefore, were not confined to land battles, but included the projection of maritime strength that would become a hallmark of the Chola imperial age. The consolidation of these conquests required more than military victories. Rajaraja was meticulous in integrating new territories into the Chola system. His inscriptions record the creation of administrative divisions, the appointment of officials, and the endowment of temples in conquered regions. These measures ensured that victories translated into lasting control rather than temporary plunder. The conquered lands were not left to languish, but were woven into the fabric of the empire, contributing taxes, resources and loyalty to the Chola state. Temples played a key role in this process of consolidation. In newly conquered territories, Rajaraja patronized local shrines and endowed them with resources, aligning religious institutions with his authority. This strategy served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it tied local populations to the Chola state through religious devotion. Symbolically, it presented Rajaraja as a dharmic ruler, one whose conquests were not acts of mere aggression, but expressions of divine will. The Brihadeeswarar Temple at Thanjavur, though the most famous example, was only the centerpiece of a larger pattern of temple patronage that reinforced Chola power across their territories. Rajaraja's military campaigns also reveal his strategic vision in terms of succession and legacy. He involved his son, Rajendra, in these conquests, ensuring that the prince gained experience and legitimacy as a commander. Rajendra accompanied his father in campaigns and commanded forces in Lanka, preparing him to inherit not only a throne, but an empire already primed for further expansion. This deliberate grooming of a successor ensured continuity and stability, preventing the kind of succession crises that had weakened earlier Chola rulers. By the end of Rajaraja's reign, the map of South India had been redrawn. The Cholas controlled the Tamil country from north to south, held significant portions of Kerala, projected power into the Deccan, and ruled northern Sri Lanka. Their influence extended across the Bay of Bengal, and their authority was recognised in courts as far away as Southeast Asia. What had begun as a dynasty revived from obscurity under Vijayalaya had now become a true empire, forged through the relentless campaigns of Rajaraja. The consolidation of empire that followed these campaigns was equally important. Rajaraja was not content with victories alone. He ensured that his conquests became enduring pillars of Chola power. He built the administrative machinery to govern them, the temples to sanctify them, and the cultural institutions to integrate them into the Chola world. His genius lay in combining the sword with the shrine, the battlefield with the bureaucracy, the conquest with the consolidation. It was this synthesis that made his empire durable and set the stage for the even greater expansions of his son. The military campaigns of Rajaraja I were thus not isolated episodes, but part of a coherent strategy to transform the Cholas into an imperial power. Each victory contributed to a larger vision. The unification of Tamilakam, the assertion of dominance in the Deccan, the control of Sri Lanka, the projection of naval power, and the integration of conquered lands into a stable administrative and religious order. Through these campaigns, Rajaraja forged an empire whose foundations were so secure that even centuries later his name remained synonymous with Chola greatness. The Brihadeeswarar Temple at Thanjavur is not only the crowning achievement of Rajaraja's reign, but also one of the most extraordinary monuments in the history of India. Known locally as Peruvudaya Kovil, it towers over the fertile Kaveri Delta, its massive stone vimana rising skyward as if to proclaim the eternal grandeur of the Cholas. Completed in the early years of the 11th century, this temple is far more than an architectural wonder. It is a political statement, a religious offering, and a cultural manifesto, encapsulating in stone the vision of kingship and empire that Rajaraja sought to project. The temple represents the moment when Chola power crystallized into form, where military conquest, administrative consolidation, and devotional fervour converged into a structure that continues to dominate the imagination 1,000 years later. The decision to build such a monument was deliberate and deeply symbolic. The Cholas, like their Pallava predecessors, understood that stone architecture could embody power more enduringly than military victories or passing wealth. Victories might be forgotten, dynasties might falter, but temples carved from granite stood across centuries, proclaiming the glory of their patrons. Rajaraja, who had already subdued Tamilakam and extended his empire into Sri Lanka and the Deccan, now sought to immortalize his achievements in a form that linked his kingship with the divine. The Brihadeeswarar Temple was not merely a shrine for Lord Shiva. It was the axis of Chola ideology, binding together empire, devotion and legitimacy. The scale of the temple was unprecedented in South India. Its central tower, or vimana, soars over 200 feet, constructed entirely of granite blocks transported from quarries miles away. The engineering feat required to raise such massive stones to such heights has puzzled historians and architects for generations. Traditional accounts suggest the use of an enormous earthen ramp several kilometres long, upon which elephants and labourers drag the stones into position. Whether or not this reconstruction is exact, it speaks to the immense organisation and resources at Rajaraja's command. To build the temple, he mobilised not only artisans and architects, but also the administrative machinery of the empire, redirecting revenues, labour and expertise into a single monumental project. The inscriptions carved into the temple walls offer unparalleled insight into how the Chola state functioned. They record in meticulous detail the gifts Rajaraja made to the temple: land, gold, jewels, lamps, and even entire villages, whose revenues were assigned to its maintenance. These inscriptions also list the names of temple dancers, musicians, priests and administrators, creating a picture of the temple as a bustling institution that employed hundreds and touched every aspect of social life. The Brihadeeswarar Temple was not only a place of worship but an economic hub, a cultural centre and a symbol of state power. Its walls bear the very DNA of the Chola Empire, etched into stone for eternity. Religiously, the temple embodied the Chola alignment with Shaivism. Rajaraja presented himself as a devotee of Lord Shiva, and by dedicating this vast structure to the deity, he linked his kingship with divine sanction. The sanctum houses a massive lingam, one of the largest in India, around which rituals and processions revolved. Yet the temple also honoured other deities, incorporating images of Vishnu, Durga, and other gods, reflecting the inclusive nature of Tamil devotion. By building a temple that was both specific in its dedication and broad in its embrace, Rajaraja ensured that the structure spoke to the religious sensibilities of a diverse population. The temple was thus not only his personal act of devotion, but a unifying symbol for the empire. Artistically, the Brihadeeswarar Temple marks a high point of Chola sculpture and painting. The walls and pillars are adorned with exquisite carvings depicting deities, mythological scenes, and royal processions. The bronzes associated with the temple, though portable rather than fixed, reflect the same mastery. These Chola bronzes, particularly the images of Nataraja, represent one of the finest achievements of Indian art, combining fluidity, grace and symbolism. Within the temple, mural paintings adorn the corridors, illustrating stories from the Shiva tradition, and perhaps even portraits of Rajaraja himself. The temple was therefore a canvas as much as a structure, an attempt to capture the universe of Chola devotion and kingship in multiple artistic forms. The political meaning of the temple is unmistakable. By constructing such an edifice in Thanjavur, the Chola capital, Rajaraja anchored his empire in a visible and enduring symbol. The temple proclaimed to subjects and rivals alike that the Cholas were not merely transient rulers, but builders of a civilization. Its grandeur dwarfed earlier structures, including the rock-cut temples of the Pallavas and the smaller shrines of the Pandyas, announcing a new scale of ambition. The temple's very stones were a declaration of supremacy, asserting that the Chola Empire was blessed by the gods and destined for permanence. The Brihadeeswarar Temple also functioned as a stage for ritual expressions of kingship. Festivals held there linked the king with the deity, reinforcing his role as both servant and representative of the divine on earth. The king's gifts to the temple, displayed publicly, demonstrated his wealth and devotion, legitimizing his rule. In processions, bronzes of the deity were paraded alongside symbols of the king, merging divine and royal authority in the eyes of the people. Through these rituals, the temple became a theatre of power, where religion and politics performed their unity. Economically, the temple tied the empire together. The villages assigned to it came from across the Chola realm, meaning that peasants in distant corners of the kingdom contributed to its upkeep. This not only provided steady resources for the temple, but also symbolically integrated the empire, making the temple a nexus through which revenues and loyalty flowed toward the capital. The temple thus served as both a religious centre and a mechanism for centralization, binding diverse regions into a shared imperial project. The legacy of the Brihadeeswarar Temple extended beyond Rajaraja's reign. It set a model that his successors followed, building great temples at Gangaikonda Cholapuram and elsewhere. These temples were not mere imitations but continuations of the same ideology. That kingship was sanctified through sacred architecture, that conquest found permanence in stone, and that empire could be expressed not only through armies but through monuments. The temple thus inaugurated a tradition of sacred architecture that defined the Chola Golden Age and left an indelible mark on South Indian history. Even centuries after the fall of the Cholas, the Brihadeeswarar Temple remained a living monument. Later dynasties, including the Nayakas and Marathas, continued to patronize it, adding to its structure and rituals. Its survival through invasions, neglect and political change testifies to the enduring power of Rajaraja's vision. Today it stands not only as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but as a symbol of Tamil identity, a reminder that the Cholas once built an empire whose achievements in art, architecture and devotion rivaled their military conquests. The Brihadeeswarar Temple is therefore not simply a monument of stone, but a crystallization of an entire worldview. It reflects the Chola synthesis of power and piety, the ability to turn conquest into permanence, the vision to see kingship as both earthly authority and divine duty. Rajaraja's campaigns gave him an empire, but the Brihadeeswarar Temple gave that empire a soul, an enduring presence that outlasted battles and dynasties. In its towering vimana, in its carved walls, in its inscriptions, one hears the echo of an age when the Cholas proclaimed to the world that they were more than kings. They were architects of a civilization blessed by the gods. Rajendra Chola III, the son and successor of Rajaraja, carried the Chola dynasty into its most ambitious and expansive phase, transforming what had already become a dominant power in South India into a far-flung empire whose reach extended across the Bay of Bengal and into the heart of Southeast Asia. If Rajaraja Skin laid the foundations of the Chola Renaissance, Rajendra was the one who expanded those foundations into an imperial superstructure. His reign, which lasted from 1014 to 1044 CE, is remembered not merely for territorial conquests, but for the audacity of vision that sought to project Chola influence far beyond the traditional bounds of Tamilakam. He was the first South Indian monarch to lead a naval expedition across the seas into Southeast Asia, leaving behind a legacy that ensured the Cholas were counted among the great world powers of the 11th century. When Rajendra ascended the throne, he inherited from his father a consolidated and prosperous empire. Rajaraja had subdued the Pandyas, humbled the Cheras, conquered parts of Sri Lanka, and extended influence into the Deccan. The administration was strong, the temples richly endowed, the ports thriving with commerce, and the army seasoned by years of campaigning. Rajendra's challenge was not to rebuild, but to expand, to demonstrate that the Chola Empire was not merely a regional power, but a universal one. He rose to this challenge with an energy and imagination that astonished contemporaries and continues to intrigue historians. One of Rajendra's earliest achievements was the conquest of the Ganga region in northern India. His forces marched across the subcontinent, defeating local rulers and reaching the banks of the sacred river. This campaign was not about permanent annexation, but about symbolic prestige. By reaching the Ganga, Rajendra proclaimed the Cholas as rulers whose influence extended across the length of India. To commemorate this feat, he assumed the title Gangaikonda Chola, meaning the Chola who took the Ganga. He brought back water from the river in golden vessels and consecrated it in a specially built reservoir at his new capital, Gangaikonda Cholapuram. This act symbolized the unification of North and South under Chola prestige, linking the empire not only to Tamil traditions, but to the pan-Indian sacred geography of the Ganges. The establishment of Gangaikonda Cholapuram as the new capital reflected Rajendra's imperial ambitions. While his father had ruled from Thanjavur, Rajendra sought to create a city that matched the grandeur of his achievements. Gangaikonda Cholapuram was laid out with monumental architecture, including a massive temple to Shiva modelled on Rajaraja's Brihadeeswara, but distinct in its proportions and ornamentation. The city became a symbol of Chola universality, a seat of power that proclaimed to the world that the Cholas were no longer bound to a single region, but had become rulers of an interconnected realm stretching across India and into the seas beyond. Rajendra's campaigns in the Deccan further demonstrated his military strength. He confronted the Western Chalukyas, continuing the rivalry inherited from his father, and secured victories that reaffirmed Chola dominance in the southern peninsula. His armies marched into Odisha and Bengal, defeating rulers along the way and securing tributaries that acknowledged Chola supremacy. These conquests reinforced the claim that Rajendra was not merely a Tamil king but an emperor whose power extended across the subcontinent. Yet it was his naval expedition to Southeast Asia that stands as the most extraordinary episode of his reign. Around 1025 CE, Rajendra launched a massive fleet across the Bay of Bengal to confront the Srivijaya Empire, a powerful maritime confederation that controlled the vital straits of Malacca and Sunda. Srivijaya dominated trade between India and China, and its rulers wielded enormous influence over the commercial arteries of the Indian Ocean. For the Cholas, whose prosperity was increasingly tied to maritime commerce, Srivijaya's dominance was both an obstacle and an opportunity. By striking at Srivijaya, Rajendra aimed not only to secure Chola merchants safe passage, but also to project his empire's might onto a global stage. The naval campaign was astonishing in its scope. Chola forces attacked key Srivijayan ports, including Kadaram, modern Kedah in Malaysia, Tambralinga in Thailand, and other settlements across the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. The inscriptions record victories that humbled Srivijaya's ruler and brought tribute to the Cholas. This was not colonization in the modern sense, but a demonstration of maritime supremacy. By projecting force across the sea and defeating a powerful overseas empire, Rajendra placed the Cholas among the handful of pre-modern states capable of sustained naval operations far from their home coasts. The psychological and diplomatic impact of this campaign was immense. Chinese records mention Chola embassies arriving at the Song court, bringing tribute and gifts, evidence of the Cholas' new status as an Indian Ocean power with connections to China. The conquest of northern Sri Lanka, begun by Rajaraja, was also completed under Rajendra, who extended Chola authority across the island. This secured a strategic base for Chola naval activity and denied their southern rivals any foothold from which to challenge them. The conquest of Lanka was not without resistance, as local rulers and Buddhist monks resisted Chola authority. But Rajendra's campaigns ensured that the northern half of the island remained firmly under Chola control for decades. Domestically, Rajendra maintained and expanded the administrative system his father had refined. His inscriptions record extensive land grants, temple endowments, and the continued functioning of local assemblies. The empire under his reign was a vast machine, powered by agrarian surplus from the Kaveri Delta and sustained by revenues from conquered lands and maritime trade. The temples, particularly the great one at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, became centres of both devotion and administration, integrating the empire's diverse regions into a shared religious and cultural framework. Rajendra's reign also fostered cultural and artistic flourishing. The Chola bronzes continued to be cast in extraordinary numbers and quality, with the image of Nataraja reaching its most iconic form. Literature in both Tamil and Sanskrit flourished, supported by royal patronage and temple institutions. The blending of artistic, religious and political energy created a civilization that radiated influence far beyond its borders. Southeast Asian states, already influenced by Indian culture, now had direct contact with the Tamil Empire, whose ships, merchants, and ambassadors carried not only goods but also ideas. What set Rajendra apart was not merely the scale of his conquests, but the coherence of his vision. He saw the Cholas as inheritors of a legacy that stretched back to Karakala and Vijayalaya, but also as rulers of a new kind of empire, one that was both territorial and maritime, both Indian and global. His assumption of the title Gangaikonda reflected this dual identity, rooted in the sacred traditions of India, yet oriented toward the wider world of commerce and diplomacy. He forged a synthesis that made the Chola Empire one of the most dynamic states of its time. By the end of his reign in 1044 CE, Rajendra had established the Cholas as a world power. Their territory stretched from the Tungabhadra in the north to Lanka in the south, from Kerala in the west to the coasts of Bengal in the east, while their fleets dominated the Bay of Bengal, and their influence reached across Southeast Asia. His legacy was one of audacity and achievement, a demonstration that a Tamil dynasty could not only dominate the subcontinent, but also shape the wider world. Rajendra Chola III's reign is therefore remembered as the age of imperial expansion, the moment when the Cholas transcended the limits of regional power and entered the annals of global history. His campaigns, his new capital, his naval expeditions, and his cultural patronage combined to create an image of the Chola Empire at its zenith, a state that commanded respect from neighbouring dynasties and distant courts alike. In him the Cholas reached their fullest expression, standing at the crossroads of India and the Indian Ocean, masters of both land and sea. The Chola navy under Rajendra Chola represents one of the most remarkable chapters in pre-modern Asian history. While many empires of the early medieval world depended primarily on land armies to establish dominance, the Cholas understood the strategic value of maritime power and built a fleet that could project authority far beyond the Indian subcontinent. Rajaraja I had already begun this process with his conquest of northern Sri Lanka, but it was under Rajendra that the Chola navy reached a level of sophistication and daring that few of their contemporaries could rival. In the early 11th century, the Cholas stood not only as conquerors of Tamilakam and much of peninsular India, but as masters of the seas, able to strike across the Bay of Bengal and challenge the most powerful maritime state of Southeast Asia, the Srivijaya Empire. The navy was not a separate institution in the modern sense, but an extension of Chola military and economic strength. The ports of the Kaveri Delta, including Kavaripattinam and Nagapattinam, served as bases where ships were built, equipped and manned. These ports were already thriving centres of commerce, drawing merchants from across Asia, and the revenues they generated provided resources for naval expeditions. The same maritime networks that carried Chola textiles, spices and jewels to foreign markets also supported the movement of troops and supplies. In this sense, the Chola navy emerged not as an isolated creation, but as a natural outgrowth of a society deeply embedded in the currents of the Indian Ocean world. Sri Lanka was the first arena in which Chola naval power was fully demonstrated. Rajaraja had conquered the northern part of the island, but resistance remained, and the Sinhala rulers in the south continued to oppose Chola authority. Rajendra launched fresh expeditions that extended Chola control further into the island, targeting Anuradhapura and later Polonnaruwa. These campaigns were brutal, involving the destruction of monuments, the looting of wealth, and the imposition of Chola governors. For the Cholas, Sri Lanka was both a strategic base and an economic prize. Its ports gave them control over sea lanes to Southeast Asia, while its resources, particularly elephants prized for war and ceremonial use, enriched the empire. The conquest of Sri Lanka also denied the Pandyas and their allies a potential partner against Chola dominance, tightening Chola hegemony in the southern seas. The real demonstration of naval supremacy, however, came with a campaign against Srivijaya around 1025 CE. Srivijaya, based in Sumatra but extending its influence across the Malay Peninsula, dominated the maritime choke points of Southeast Asia. By controlling the Straits of Malacca and Sunda, Srivijaya effectively managed the trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, collecting tribute from merchants and kingdoms that passed through its waters. For the Cholas, whose prosperity increasingly depended on overseas trade, this dominance was intolerable. Rajendra therefore launched a naval expedition of unprecedented scale, sending fleets across the Bay of Bengal to strike directly at Srivijaya's heart. The Chola inscriptions that describe this campaign list a series of targets: Kadaram, modern Kedah in Malaysia, Tambralinga in southern Thailand, and other settlements in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. The fleet attacked these ports, defeated local rulers, and brought back immense booty. The Srivijaya ruler Sangrama Vijayotungavarman was captured or at least humbled, and Chola authority was proclaimed across the region. The purpose of this campaign was not to annex territory permanently, but to break Srivijaya's monopoly and assert Chola supremacy in the maritime sphere. By doing so, Rajendra opened the sea lanes to Chola merchants, ensuring that Tamil traders could reach China and Southeast Asia without hindrance. The impact of this campaign reverberated widely. Chinese records note the arrival of Chola embassies at the Song court, bearing tribute and exotic gifts. This demonstrates that the Cholas had not only broken into the maritime networks of Southeast Asia, but also established direct contact with the greatest empire of East Asia. For a Tamil dynasty based in the Kaveri Delta to send embassies across the seas to China was extraordinary, underscoring the global reach of Chola power at its zenith. In the Indian Ocean world of the 11th century, the Cholas stood as one of the few states capable of mounting long-distance naval expeditions that combined military force with diplomatic and commercial aims. The naval campaigns also reveal the integration of Chola society into maritime commerce. Merchant guilds such as the Ayavale 500 and Manigramam played a vital role, financing trade, organising shipping, and interacting with foreign states. These guilds often accompanied Chola expeditions, ensuring that military victories were followed by commercial opportunities. In this sense, the Chola navy functioned not only as an arm of the state, but as a facilitator of economic expansion, binding together merchants, temples, and kings in a shared project of imperial growth. The Chola mastery of the seas also reshaped the cultural geography of South and Southeast Asia. Tamil merchants and artisans settled in ports from Sri Lanka to Sumatra, carrying with them their language, religion, and artistic traditions. Temples dedicated to Hindu deities appeared in foreign lands, often supported by Tamil merchant communities. The Chola campaigns thus contributed to the wider process sometimes called Indianization, where Indian cultural forms spread across Southeast Asia. Yet the Chola role was not passive diffusion but active assertion. Their fleets carried not only traders but also armies, making clear that Tamil power was a force to be reckoned with across the region. Within the Chola realm, the naval victories enhanced the prestige of Rajendra and his dynasty. Inscriptions record the glory of these campaigns, boasting of victories won across the seas and enemies humbled in distant lands. Rajendra assumed titles that proclaimed his maritime achievements, presenting himself as a ruler whose authority extended beyond the horizon. The construction of his new capital at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, with its monumental temple, further symbolised the universal claims of his kingship. Just as he had brought the waters of the Ganga to the south, he had also extended Chola power across the ocean, uniting land and sea under his banner. The expeditions to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia thus represent more than episodes of conquest. They embody the Chola synthesis of power, commerce, and culture. The navy was not an end in itself, but a tool through which the Cholas secured trade routes, enhanced their prestige, and projected their identity into the wider world. The campaigns reveal an empire confident in its strength, willing to take risks, and capable of coordinating complex operations across vast distances. In the 11th century, few other states in the world could match this combination of military, economic, and cultural reach. By the time of Rajendra's death in 1044 CE, the Cholas had established themselves as the paramount maritime power of the Indian Ocean. Their fleets had subdued Sri Lanka, humbled Srivijaya, and secured the prosperity of Tamil merchants from Bengal to China. The legacy of these naval campaigns endured long after, shaping the fortunes of the Chola dynasty and leaving a deep imprint on the interconnected world of Asia. In the story of the Cholas, the mastery of the seas under Rajendra stands as one of the clearest signs that this was not merely a regional dynasty, but a true empire, one that bridged continents and oceans in its quest for power and glory. The Chola Empire did not endure for centuries on the basis of conquest alone. Armies could win battles and fleets could carry the banners of kings across seas, but without a durable system of governance, such victories would fade quickly. What distinguished the Cholas, particularly from the time of Rajaraja and Rajendra onward, was the sophistication of their administration. They created a system that combined centralised royal authority with an extraordinary degree of local participation, a bureaucracy that relied not only on appointed officials but also on village assemblies and temple institutions. This model of governance ensured stability, integrated conquered territories into the Chola world, and allowed the empire to stretch across southern India and into overseas provinces without disintegrating under the weight of its own ambition. At the heart of the Chola administrative system was the king, whose authority was absolute in theory but carefully mediated in practice. Inscriptions describe the king as the protector of Dharma, the upholder of justice, and the patron of temples. He was the source of law and the ultimate arbiter of disputes. Yet his power was expressed not through arbitrary decisions, but through institutions that embedded royal will in the everyday life of subjects. Rajaraja Thawar and Rajendra I, for instance, issued copperplate charters granting lands to Brahmins or temples, specifying tax arrangements and obligations with extraordinary precision. These documents reveal kingship as both personal and institutional. The monarch was a figure of divine sanction, but his authority operated through bureaucratic detail. The empire was divided into broad territorial units known as mandalams, which corresponded roughly to provinces. Each mandalam encompassed several valanadus, or districts, and each valanadu contained multiple nadus, which were clusters of villages. At the base of this hierarchy was the or village assembly, which played a central role in Chola governance. This layered system allowed the empire to manage vast areas effectively. Orders from the king filtered down through the mandalams and valanadus, but local assemblies handled day-to-day administration, tax collection, and the resolution of disputes. The balance between central oversight and local autonomy was one of the keys to Chola success. The village assemblies were among the most distinctive features of Chola administration. There were two main types: the Yuar, composed of the general body of villagers, and the Sabha, a more formal assembly of Brahmin landowners in Brahmadeya villages. A third type, the Nagaram, represented merchant guilds in urban areas. These assemblies managed land distribution, irrigation works, local temples, and the collection of taxes. In some cases, the members of the assembly were chosen through a sophisticated system of lot drawing which ensured fairness and minimized corruption. Inscriptions carved on the walls of temples record the decisions of these assemblies in meticulous detail, including land boundaries, tax rates, and rules for managing common resources. The transparency and formality of these records demonstrate the advanced nature of Chola bureaucracy. The role of temples in administration cannot be overstated. Temples were not merely religious centres, but economic institutions that owned land, employed workers, and stored wealth. The Chola kings endowed temples with villages, tax-free lands, and revenues from trade. In return, temples acted as anchors of royal authority and local society. They housed inscriptions recording royal orders, provided spaces for assembly meetings, and redistributed resources through their vast networks of dependents. In this way, the temple served as both a spiritual and administrative hub, tying together devotion, economy, and governance. The Cholas also developed an efficient system of taxation. Land was the primary source of revenue, and assessments were carried out with care. Officials measured fields, categorized them according to fertility, and levied taxes accordingly. These taxes were often paid in kind, with grain, oil, or livestock, but could also be rendered in cash in regions with strong trade networks. In addition to land revenue, taxes were levied on professional groups, markets, and sometimes on household goods. The revenue was then distributed to maintain the army, build temples, support irrigation works, and sustain the bureaucracy. Irrigation management was a crucial aspect of administration in the Kaveri Delta, the heart of the Chola Empire. The prosperity of this region depended on elaborate networks of canals, tanks, and embankments that regulated the river's waters. Village assemblies often took responsibility for maintaining these systems, but royal officials supervised large-scale projects. Inscriptions from Rajaraja's reign describe the excavation of new tanks and the repair of old ones, reflecting the centrality of water management to governance. By ensuring regular harvests, the Cholas secured the agrarian surplus that fueled their military and cultural endeavours. The bureaucracy itself was staffed by a range of officials whose titles and functions are recorded in inscriptions. At the provincial level, officers such as the Perundanam and Perundaram oversaw revenue and military matters. In the districts and villages, minor officials recorded tax collections and maintained accounts. These bureaucrats were often drawn from local elites, ensuring that royal administration was integrated with local society. At the same time, the Cholas cultivated loyalty by rewarding service with land grants, honours, and positions in temple management. The result was a symbiotic relationship between state and society, where officials enforced royal authority while communities retained significant autonomy. Justice was another area where Chola governance was distinctive. Village assemblies adjudicated minor disputes, while serious crimes could be referred to higher authorities or even to the king himself. Punishments ranged from fines and confiscation of property to corporal penalties. In some cases, inscriptions record disputes being resolved through arbitration by respected elders or temple authorities, reflecting a legal culture that combined royal law with customary practice. The emphasis on documentation ensured that judgments were preserved for posterity, providing a sense of stability and fairness. Merchants and guilds also played an important role in the administrative framework. Organisations like the Ayavale 500 and Manigramam operated with royal support, regulating trade, settling disputes, and representing merchant interest abroad. These guilds maintained their own rules and charters, but functioned within the Chola system, paying taxes and supporting temples. In overseas ports, Tamil merchants often acted as informal representatives of Chola power, blending commerce with diplomacy. The integration of merchant guilds into governance ensured that economic expansion was aligned with political authority. What made the Chola system so effective was its ability to adapt and integrate. Conquered territories were not governed solely by imposition from above, but were absorbed into existing structures of local administration. In Sri Lanka, for example, Chola governors worked alongside local assemblies, while in newly conquered Deccan territories, land grants tied Brahmins and temples to Chola rule. This flexibility allowed the empire to maintain cohesion despite its vastness and diversity. The Chola bureaucracy also reveals the dynasty's understanding of legitimacy. Royal orders were inscribed on stone or copper plates, creating permanent records that could not easily be ignored or forgotten. Temples displayed these inscriptions publicly, ensuring that the king's will was visible to all. The very act of inscribing decisions in durable materials reinforced the authority of the state, turning governance into a ritual of permanence. By combining central authority with local autonomy, by embedding administration in temples and assemblies, and by maintaining detailed records, the Cholas created a system of governance that was both stable and dynamic. It allowed them to sustain one of the largest empires in South Indian history, to integrate distant territories into a coherent whole, and to project their power far beyond their heartland. The Chola bureaucracy was not perfect. There were tensions, rivalries, and occasional rebellions, but its effectiveness was such that later dynasties, from the Pandyas to the Vijayanagara rulers, inherited and adapted many of its features. The governance of the Cholas was therefore more than a means of control. It was a reflection of their vision of kingship, one that combined divine sanction with practical efficiency, centralized authority with local participation, and military conquest with cultural integration. It ensured that the Chola Empire was not a fleeting phenomenon, but a durable civilization, remembered not only for its temples and conquests, but also for its institutions of governance. The Chola Golden Age was not only an era of military conquest and administrative brilliance, it was also a time when temples, art, and literature reached a flowering that has scarcely been paralleled in Indian history. The prosperity generated by conquests, trade, and agrarian surplus provided the resources, while the devotional fervour of the Bhakti movement supplied the inspiration. The result was a civilization in which stone and bronze, verse and hymn, sculpture and painting all combined to express a vision of beauty and devotion that remains vibrant more than a millennium later. The Cholas understood that empire could be made visible not only through armies and inscriptions, but also through temples that touch the sky, bronzes that captured divine grace, and texts that gave voice to spiritual longing. This cultural outpouring was as central to their identity as their political power, and it is perhaps the most enduring legacy of their rule. Temples stood at the very heart of this cultural world. The Cholas built on earlier traditions established by the Pallavas and Pandyas, but took temple architecture to new heights of scale and ambition. Rajarajasiwa's Brihadeeswarar Temple at Thanjavur and Rajendra's temple at Gangekonda Cholapuram are the most famous examples, but dozens of other shrines across Tamilakam testify to the vigour of Chola patronage. These temples were not modest village shrines, but monumental complexes, with towering vimanas, pillared halls, sculpted gateways and enclosures that housed not only deities, but entire communities of priests, dancers, musicians and administrators. They were built of granite and decorated with exquisite carvings, projecting Chola power in forms that were both sacred and imperial. The symbolism of temple building was profound. To construct a great temple was to anchor kingship in the divine, to demonstrate that the ruler was not merely a political authority, but a protector of Dharma. The temples also served as repositories of wealth, where gold, jewels and land grants were stored and recorded. Inscriptions carved into the very walls of these temples detail donations, festivals, and the names of those employed in temple service. A single Chola temple could employ hundreds of people, from priests and cooks to dancers and artisans, turning it into a centre of economic as well as spiritual life. Temples thus became engines of cultural production, sustaining art, music and literature through their patronage. Among the most striking contributions of the Chola age are the bronzes, masterpieces of Indian art that continue to astonish with their elegance and vitality. These bronzes were created using the lost wax method, which allowed artisans to achieve extraordinary detail and fluidity. The most iconic of these images is the Nataraja, the dancing form of Shiva, whose raised leg, encircling flame and serene expression embody cosmic rhythm and divine grace. Chola bronzes were not static idols but living presences, carried in processions during festivals, adorned with garlands and jewels and worshipped by devotees. They combined artistic mastery with religious function, transforming metal into embodiments of the divine. The bronzes also reveal the cosmopolitan nature of Chola society. Many were commissioned not only for temples in Tamilakam, but also for overseas communities in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, carried by merchant guilds and settlers across the seas. In this way, the Chola aesthetic spread far beyond India, influencing artistic traditions in lands as distant as Java and Cambodia. Even today, the Chola bronzes are regarded as among the greatest artistic achievements of humanity, housed in museums around the world yet still alive in Tamil rituals. Painting too flourished under the Cholas. Though fewer examples survive than of sculpture, the murals in temples such as Brihadeeswarar offer glimpses of the richness of Chola painting. These murals depict scenes from Shaiva mythology, processions of deities, and even portraits of kings and queens, blending religious narrative with royal propaganda. The use of vibrant colours, dynamic lines and expressive faces demonstrates that Chola art was not limited to stone and metal, but extended to the painted wall, creating immersive environments where devotees were surrounded by the presence of gods and kings alike. Literature was another domain in which the Chola age shone brightly. The Bhakti movement, which had begun earlier with the hymns of the Nayanmars and Alvas, continued to flourish under Chola patronage. Collections such as the Tevaram, the hymns of the Shaiva saints, were canonized, preserved in temples, and sung daily in rituals. The Cholas ensured that these hymns became part of the liturgical life of their realm, intertwining devotion with the rhythms of temple worship. Inscriptions reveal that singers were employed in temples specifically to perform these hymns, institutionalizing Bhakti poetry as part of state-supported religion. Secular literature also thrived. Tamil poets composed works that celebrated kings, battles, and moral ideals. Epics such as Kamban's Ramavataram, though composed slightly later, emerged within the cultural environment sustained by Chola patronage. In Sanskrit, scholars and poets also found support at the Chola court, producing texts on philosophy, ritual, and governance. The coexistence of Tamil and Sanskrit traditions reflects the inclusive character of Chola culture, where regional identity and pan-Indian traditions intertwined. Music and dance were integral to this cultural flowering. Temples employed entire troops of dancers, known as Brihadeeswarar, who performed during rituals and festivals. Musicians played drums, flutes, and stringed instruments, accompanying the recitation of hymns and the movements of dancers. This integration of performance into temple life ensured that the arts were not peripheral but central to Chola society. Dance and music were not entertainment alone but offerings to the divine, expressions of devotion that merged aesthetics with spirituality. The golden age of Chola art and literature was sustained by the empire's wealth and stability. The surplus generated by agriculture in the Kaveri Delta, the revenues from conquered territories, and the profits of maritime trade all flowed into temples and courts, creating the conditions for artistic production. The bureaucracy recorded donations in precise detail, ensuring that resources were directed to maintain temples, pay artists, and sponsor festivals. The combination of economic prosperity and administrative efficiency allowed cultural life to flourish on an unprecedented scale. Yet this flowering was not mere ornamentation of empire. It was part of the very structure of Chola power. Temples projected authority into conquered regions. Bronzes embodied divine sanction for kingship. Hymns proclaimed loyalty to both god and king, and literature celebrated the unity of Tamil identity and imperial ambition. The arts were not separate from politics, but intertwined with it, giving the Chola Empire a cultural legitimacy that made its power resonate far beyond the battlefield. Even centuries later, the legacy of this golden age endures. The temples still stand, their walls bearing inscriptions that preserve the memory of Chola kings. The bronzes still dance, their forms admired in museums and still carried in processions in Tamil Nadu. The hymns of the Nayanmars and Alvas continue to be sung in temples, linking today's worshippers with the voices of a millennium past. The literature of the age remains part of the Tamil canon, studied, recited, and cherished. Through these enduring works, the Cholas continue to shape cultural identity long after their empire has vanished. The golden age of the Cholas was therefore not only a time of imperial grandeur, but a civilizational peak in which temples, art, and literature came together to create a legacy of extraordinary richness. It was a world in which granite towers touched the sky, bronze gods danced in torchlight, hymns echoed through temple halls, and poets gave voice to devotion and glory. In this fusion of power and beauty, the Cholas created not only an empire but a cultural heritage that remains one of the treasures of humanity. By the time Kulothunga ascended the throne in the latter part of the 11th century, the Chola dynasty had already enjoyed more than a century of imperial brilliance under Rajaraja Thiyam, Rajendra, and their immediate successors. The empire had extended from the Tungabhadra in the north to Sri Lanka in the south, from Kerala in the west to Bengal in the east, and its fleets had crossed the Bay of Bengal to humble Srivijaya. Yet the very scale of this expansion also brought strains, wars on multiple fronts, the challenge of integrating diverse territories, and the constant pressure of rival powers in the Deccan and beyond. Into this environment came Kulothunga I, a ruler remembered less for audacious conquests than for his ability to preserve and consolidate what had been won. His reign, which lasted from 1070 to 1122 CE, is one of the longest in Chola history, and it represents a shift in emphasis from outward expansion to careful consolidation, administration, and stability. Kulothunga's background was itself unusual, reflecting the complex web of dynastic politics in the south. He was not the direct son of the preceding Chola king, but a descendant of the eastern Chalukyas of Vengi through his father and of the Cholas through his mother. His accession represented the fusion of two powerful lineages, the Cholas and the Chalukyas, and it was achieved in a period of uncertainty. The later years of the 11th century had seen turbulence, with rival claimants to the throne and challenges from the Chalukyas of Kalyani. Kulothunga's rise stabilized the situation, and his reign inaugurated what is often called the later Chola period. One of Kulothunga's most significant achievements was the integration of Vengi into the Chola realm. The Vengi country, located in the fertile Godavari Delta, had long been contested between the Cholas and the western Chalukyas. Kulotunga's eastern Chalukya lineage allowed him to unite the throne of Vengi with that of the Cholas, creating a political entity that stretched from the Kaveri to the Godavari. This union not only expanded the territorial base of the empire but also secured a critical agricultural and maritime region. Vengi's ports were important nodes in the Indian Ocean trade, linking the Chola heartland to Southeast Asia and beyond. By consolidating Vengi, Kulotunga ensured that the Cholas retained their position as a maritime power, even as they shifted focus from conquest to stability. Militarily, Kulotunga's reign was marked more by defence and management than by aggressive campaigns. He faced challenges from the western Chalukyas, whose rulers continued to press against Chola territories in the Deccan. While the Cholas won some victories and suffered some reverses, the overall balance was one of stalemate, with neither side able to decisively crush the other. This long rivalry drained resources but also forced the Cholas to maintain their military preparedness. In Sri Lanka, Chola authority persisted, but faced resistance from local rulers and Buddhist clergy, and by the later years of Kulotunga's reign, Chola control over parts of the island weakened. Yet despite these pressures, the empire itself remained intact, a testimony to the durability of the systems established by earlier rulers and maintained by Kulotunga. Administratively, Kulotunga continued the traditions of his predecessors, reinforcing the structures that allowed the Chola Empire to govern vast territories. Inscriptions from his reign record detailed land grants, tax arrangements, and temple endowments, reflecting the ongoing vitality of local assemblies and temple-centered administration. The village sabhas continued to manage resources, irrigation, and justice, while the central bureaucracy coordinated revenues and military logistics. Kulotunga's long reign allowed for continuity and stability, qualities that were essential for preserving imperial cohesion in a period when rivals pressed from all sides. Economically, the Chola Empire under Kulotunga remained prosperous, benefiting from the fertile deltas of the Kaveri and Godavari, as well as from the maritime trade routes that linked Tamilakam to Southeast Asia and China. Merchant guilds such as the Ayavale 500 and Manigramam continued to flourish, carrying Tamil goods abroad and bringing back wealth that sustained temples and courts. Kulotunga's reign is notable for references to embassies reaching as far as China, a reminder that even in an era of consolidation, the Cholas remained deeply engaged in the wider world. Culturally, the later Chola period sustained the momentum of the Golden Age. Temples continued to be built and endowed, bronzes continued to be cast, and hymns continued to be sung in daily rituals. The temple at Chidambaram gained prominence during this period, with Kulotunga playing a role in promoting its rituals and festivals. Literary activity also persisted, with Tamil and Sanskrit texts being produced under royal and temple patronage. While the artistic output may not have matched the monumental scale of Rajaraja's Brihadeeswarar or Rajendra's Gangaikonda Cholapuram, it nevertheless reflected a thriving cultural life deeply intertwined with governance and devotion. The reign of Kulotunga. It also highlights the challenges of balancing imperial ambition with practical governance. By the time he came to power, the limits of Chola expansion had become apparent. The great conquests of Rajaraja and Rajendra could not be indefinitely repeated without overextending the empire's resources. Kulotunga recognised this reality and emphasised consolidation over conquest. His focus on integrating Vengi, defending against the Chalukyas, and maintaining maritime connections reflects a pragmatic approach that ensured the longevity of the empire. He did not seek to match his predecessors in spectacular campaigns, but he succeeded in preserving the empire through one of its longest reigns, a feat that in itself was a remarkable achievement. By the end of Kulotunga's reign in 1122 CE, the Chola Empire remained one of the great powers of South Asia. Its influence still stretched across peninsular India, its merchants still sailed to Southeast Asia, its temples still radiated grandeur, and its administrative system still functioned with remarkable efficiency. Yet the era of unchecked expansion had passed, and the Cholas had entered a phase of maturity where preservation mattered more than conquest. This transition was not a decline, but a recalibration, a recognition that empire required balance as much as ambition. Kulotunga's era of consolidation thus represents the latest Cholas at their strongest, a dynasty that had learned from the triumphs and strains of the imperial century, and settled into a role as guardians of a vast, complex and prosperous realm. His reign ensured that the Cholas remained a central force in South Indian history for another century, sustaining the cultural, political and economic legacies of the Golden Age even as the world around them began to change. The Chola Empire reached its height not only through military conquest and administrative strength, but also through its active participation in the wider networks of trade and diplomacy that connected the Indian Ocean world in the 11th and 12th centuries. If the Brihadeeswarar Temple at Thanjavur and the city of Gangaikonda Cholapuram symbolized Chola power in stone, then the ships that sailed from Nagapattinam and Kaverapattinam symbolized their reach across seas, carrying Tamil merchants, artisans and emissaries to lands as distant as Sumatra, China and Arabia. The Cholas understood that the prosperity of their empire depended as much on commerce and diplomatic relations as on the sword, and they cultivated a world system in which Tamil goods, Tamil culture and Tamil political authority played a central role. The geographical position of the Chola heartland in the Kaveri and Godavari deltas gave the dynasty a natural advantage in maritime activity. These fertile regions produced an agricultural surplus that supported large populations and armies, while their riverine ports opened directly to the Bay of Bengal. From these harbours, ships could sail eastward to Southeast Asia and China, or westward around Sri Lanka into the Arabian Sea and beyond to the Persian Gulf. This dual orientation made the Cholas a pivotal link between the eastern and western halves of the Indian Ocean, positioning them at the crossroads of global commerce. Tamil merchants were already active in overseas trade before the rise of the Cholas, but under Chola patronage their activities reached new heights. Merchant guilds such as the Manigramam, Ayavole 500, and Nana Daisy operated across the subcontinent and into foreign lands, maintaining networks of trade, credit and protection. These guilds were highly organised, with their own charters, officials and internal regulations, and they often acted with the backing of royal authority. Inscriptions from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra, and even Southeast Asia record their presence, testifying to the scale of their operations. They traded in textiles, particularly fine cottons and silks, which were highly prized across Asia, in spices such as pepper and cardamom, in gems, pearls and ivory, and in horses, metals and luxury goods imported from the Middle East and Central Asia. The Chola state actively supported this trade, recognising its value as a source of revenue and prestige. Ports such as Nagapattinam became bustling centres of commerce, where merchants from China, Southeast Asia, Arabia and even Africa converged. The Cholas invested in infrastructure, ensuring the safety of routes, regulating tariffs, and patronising temples that served as focal points for merchant activity. Nagapattinam, for instance, housed not only Hindu temples but also a Buddhist vihara, built with the support of the Chola kings and foreign merchants, symbolising the cosmopolitan nature of Chola port cities. Diplomacy was a natural extension of commerce. Chola rulers sent embassies to foreign courts, often in conjunction with merchant activity. Records in Chinese sources mention Chola embassies arriving at the Song dynasty court, bearing gifts and tribute and establishing formal relations. These embassies were not merely ceremonial, they opened channels for trade, secured privileges for Tamil merchants, and projected the Cholas as a recognised power in the international system of their day. The campaign against Srivijaya in 1025 CE, led by Rajendra the Vaths, must be understood in this context. It was both a military assertion and a diplomatic manoeuvre, intended to break a rival's monopoly and secure Chola access to Chinese markets. The Chola interaction with Southeast Asia was multifaceted. Beyond warfare, they engaged in cultural exchange, diplomacy and settlement. Tamil merchant guilds established themselves in ports such as Kedah, Sumatra and Thailand, where inscriptions in Tamil record their activities. These communities carried with them not only goods but also religious and artistic traditions. Temples dedicated to Hindu deities, often supported by Tamil merchants, appeared in Southeast Asia, blending with local traditions to create hybrid cultural forms. Chola diplomacy with Southeast Asian rulers reinforced these connections, with some rulers seeking alliances or exchanges with the powerful Tamil Empire to strengthen their own positions. The Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea were also important arenas of Chola maritime activity. Tamil merchants traded with ports in present-day Oman, Yemen and the Persian Gulf, carrying textiles and spices and bringing back horses, which were vital for Chola cavalry forces. The Cholas did not directly conquer these regions, but their merchants and emissaries ensured that Tamil goods were well represented in Gulf markets. Arab geographers and travellers of the time mention the wealth of the Coromandel coast, describing its textiles as among the finest in the world. These accounts confirm the integration of the Chola economy into global circuits of exchange. The role of temples in trade and diplomacy should not be overlooked. Temples were not only centres of worship but also economic institutions that acted as banks, warehouses and guarantors of trust. Merchant guilds often made donations to temples, and temples in turn provided legitimacy and protection to merchants. Temples located near ports, such as those in Nagapattinam, were deeply enmeshed in maritime commerce, sanctifying transactions and creating a moral framework for trade. This integration of sacred and economic life gave Chola commerce a distinctive character, in which devotion and profit were interwoven. The Cholas also benefited from the global demand for Indian textiles. Fine cottons from the Coromandel coast were shipped in large quantities to Southeast Asia, where they were exchanged for spices, and to China, where they were prized by elites. These textiles even reached the Middle East and Africa, carried along trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The wealth generated by this trade flowed back into the Chola Empire, funding temples, patronising artists, and sustaining the administrative apparatus. Without this commercial foundation, the grandeur of the Chola Golden Age would not have been possible. Diplomatic relations extended beyond commerce. The Cholas saw themselves as part of a larger ecumene of kingship and civilization. By sending embassies to China, engaging with Southeast Asian rulers, and maintaining ties with distant lands, they asserted their place within a world order that recognized mutual prestige and exchange. In this sense, Chola diplomacy was not unlike that of contemporary empires elsewhere, such as the Abbasids or the Song dynasty, which used embassies and gift exchanges to affirm their status. The Cholas, however, brought to this system the distinct identity of a Tamil empire, projecting their cultural and political values into an international sphere. The maritime trade and diplomacy of the Cholas also had long-term cultural consequences. Tamil communities established abroad left enduring legacies in Southeast Asia, visible in inscriptions, place names, and artistic motifs. The flow of goods was accompanied by the flow of ideas, architectural styles, religious rituals, literary forms, all of which enriched the cultural landscapes of both India and Southeast Asia. The Chola world system was thus not only an economic phenomenon, but a cultural one, knitting together diverse regions into a shared space of exchange and interaction. By the 12th century, under Kulotunga III and his successors, the Cholas continued to benefit from maritime trade, though their emphasis shifted from conquest to consolidation. Merchant guilds remained active, embassies continued to reach China, and Tamil goods retained their global prominence. Even as military campaigns slowed, the Cholas maintained their position in the Indian Ocean world through the strength of their commerce and diplomacy. The Chola engagement with maritime trade and diplomacy illustrates how deeply embedded they were in the global currents of their age. They were not an insular dynasty confined to the Kaveri Delta, but a cosmopolitan empire that shaped and was shaped by the Indian Ocean system. Their ships carried goods and warriors, their temples anchored communities abroad, their embassies reached foreign courts, and their culture left an imprint far beyond Tamilakam. The Chola world was therefore not only territorial but oceanic, a reminder that in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Indian Ocean was already a stage of globalization, and the Cholas were among its most formidable actors. The grandeur of the Chola Empire, which had dazzled the Indian Ocean world in the 11th century, began to fade during the 13th. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process shaped by a combination of internal weaknesses and the resurgence of rivals, particularly the Pandyas. For more than 3 centuries, the Cholas had maintained their dominance through military might, administrative efficiency and maritime commerce, but no empire can remain at its zenith forever. Pressures from within, succession disputes, overextension of resources, weakening central control, combined with external challenges from the Pandyas, Hoysalas and others, eventually eroded the empire's foundations. By the end of the 13th century, the Cholas had lost their position as the paramount power of Tamilakam, ceding the stage once more to the Pandyas, who reclaimed their place as a major force in South Indian politics. The seeds of decline were sown even in the later Chola period. After the reign of Kulotunga I, which had emphasised consolidation, his successors faced the increasingly difficult task of maintaining a vast empire amid shifting political dynamics. The Western Chalukyas and later the Hoysalas pressed from the Deccan, contesting control of Vengi and the Tungabhadra region. In Sri Lanka, Chola authority steadily eroded as local rulers reasserted themselves and Buddhist institutions resisted foreign domination. In the north, Chola influence in Odisha and Bengal waned. The empire that Rajendra the Farm had stretched across India was contracting, and successive rulers found themselves on the defensive rather than on the offensive. Internal struggles added to the pressures. The Chola dynasty was marked by a tradition of multiple claimants to the throne, with collateral branches of the royal family often competing for succession. These disputes weakened the continuity of leadership and created factions within the court. Inscriptions from the 12th and 13th centuries reveal instances of overlapping claims and rivalries between different Chola princes. Such divisions made it harder to project unity, and they gave opportunities for rivals to intervene in Chola affairs. Economically, the empire remained prosperous for much of this period, but the costs of maintaining large armies, supporting monumental temples and financing overseas expeditions strained resources. As territories slipped from Chola control, the revenues they provided were lost. Merchant guilds continued to operate, but the balance of maritime power in the Bay of Bengal was shifting. Southeast Asian kingdoms that had once acknowledged Chola supremacy, such as Srivijaya and its successors, recovered and reasserted themselves. The Cholas no longer possessed the ability to launch the kind of naval expeditions that Rajendra Rai had once led. The greatest challenge, however, came from the south. The Pandyas, long the rivals of the Cholas, had endured centuries of subjugation but never disappeared. Their capital at Madurai remained a symbol of Tamil identity and a centre of political and religious life. By the late 12th century, under rulers such as Jatavarman Sundara Pandya, the dynasty experienced a resurgence. The Pandyas rebuilt their armies, re-established their authority over the southern Tamil country, and began to challenge Chola supremacy directly. Their revival was fueled by both internal strength and the weakening of Chola authority, which allowed them to rally support among local chieftains and assemblies that had grown discontent with Chola rule. The rivalry between the Cholas and Pandyas once again defined the politics of Tamilakam, as it had centuries earlier. Battles were fought for control of key cities and regions, with the balance increasingly tilting toward the Pandyas. By the mid-13th century, the Pandyas had decisively reasserted their dominance, defeating Chola forces and capturing territory that had once formed the core of the Chola Empire. Inscriptions from this period often depict the Cholas as subordinate or reduced to holding only fragments of their former domain. The Hoysalas too played a role in Chola decline. Based in Karnataka, the Hoysala kings extended their influence into the northern Tamil country, sometimes allying with the Pandyas against the Cholas, at other times acting independently. Their interventions further destabilized the region and eroded Chola power. The once formidable empire was now caught in a pincer between resurgent southern rivals and ambitious northern neighbours. Culturally, the Chola legacy endured even as political power waned. Temples continued to function, bronzes continued to be worshipped, and the hymns of the Bhakti saints continued to be sung. Yet the scale of royal patronage diminished, and the grandeur of temple construction slowed. The Cholas remained respected as dynasty, but their ability to project authority through monumental projects and overseas ventures had diminished. By the late 13th century, the Cholas were reduced to little more than regional rulers in parts of the Kaveri Delta. The Pandyas, under strong monarchs such as Maravaman Kulasekara Pandya, emerged as the leading power of South India, extending their influence even into Sri Lanka and confronting northern dynasties on equal terms. The Cholas, once masters of the seas and rulers of a pan-Indian empire, now found themselves overshadowed by rivals they had once subdued. The internal struggles of succession, the erosion of territorial control, the loss of maritime supremacy, and the resurgence of the Pandyas together explain the decline of Chola power. Unlike some dynasties that vanish abruptly under foreign conquest, the Cholas faded gradually, their institutions persisting even as their political authority dwindled. Village assemblies continued to meet, temples continued to thrive, and inscriptions continued to record donations. But the grand vision of an imperial Chola state was no longer realizable. The decline of the Cholas also serves as a reminder of the cyclical nature of South Indian politics. Just as the Pallavas had once overshadowed the Cholas, and just as the Cholas had later eclipsed the Pandyas, so too did the Pandyas reclaim their moment of glory at the expense of the Cholas. The rhythms of rivalry, resurgence and decline define the history of Tamilakam across centuries, with each dynasty rising in turn, drawing on the same fertile lands, the same cultural traditions, and the same oceanic networks that had sustained their predecessors. By the time the Chola line came to an end in the 14th century, absorbed into the Pandya resurgence and later overshadowed by the rise of the Delhi Sultanate and the Vijayanagara Empire, their political power was gone. Yet their legacy remained in the temples that still stood, in the bronzes that still danced, in the literature that still sang, and in the memory of a golden age when Tamil ships had ruled the seas and Tamil kings had sent embassies to China. The decline of Chola power was real, but it did not erase the Chola presence in history. It simply closed a chapter in the long story of Tamil civilization. By the beginning of the 13th century, the Chola dynasty was already a shadow of what it had been during the reigns of Rajaraja and Rajendra. The vast empire that had once stretched across peninsular India and projected its fleets into Southeast Asia had been eroded on every frontier. The Pandyas had risen again in the south, the Hoysalas pressed from the west, and in the north the Cholas had lost their influence in Vengi and beyond. What remained was the heartland in the Kaveri Delta, still wealthy and fertile, still dotted with temples that testified to the grandeur of earlier kings, but politically weakened and vulnerable. The 13th century would prove to be the final act in the Chola story, as internal disunity and relentless external pressure combined to bring about the fall of one of South India's greatest dynasties. The early part of the century was marked by efforts to hold together what remained of the Chola realm. Successors of Kulatunga, such as Kulatunga II and Rajaraja II, sought to preserve authority through a mixture of diplomacy and defence, but their reigns revealed the difficulty of balancing Chola prestige with the reality of diminished power. Rajaraja Tunku's inscriptions still boast of temple endowments and administrative activity, but militarily the Cholas were no longer the aggressors they had once been. Instead of launching ambitious campaigns, they were increasingly confined to reacting against encroachments by the Pandyas and Hoysalas. The Pandyas, under strong monarchs such as Jatavarman Sundara Pandya the Rud, decisively reasserted themselves during this period. By the mid-13th century, they had not only regained control of their traditional heartlands around Madurai, but had expanded their influence across much of Tamilakam. They challenged the Cholas directly, defeating their armies in battle and annexing Chola territories. The Pandyas also looked outward, sending expeditions to Sri Lanka and competing with the Hoysalas for supremacy in the south. For the first time in centuries, it was the Pandyas, not the Cholas, who stood as the dominant power of the region. The Hoysalas further complicated the picture. Based in Karnataka, they pressed into northern Tamil country, sometimes supporting the Cholas, sometimes opposing them, depending on shifting alliances. The Cholas often found themselves caught between these two ambitious powers, unable to resist both simultaneously. The delicate diplomacy required to manage these rivalries sapped Chola strength, and their position weakened further with each passing decade. Internally, succession disputes exacerbated the decline. Unlike the earlier centuries of the dynasty, when strong rulers such as Rajaraja and Rajendra had provided continuity, the 13th century saw rival claimants emerge from different branches of the royal family. Inscriptions from the period show confusion over succession, with overlapping claims and contested authority. This fragmentation of the royal house eroded central authority and emboldened local chieftains, who asserted greater autonomy in their regions. The cohesion that had once allowed the Cholas to dominate peninsular India was gone, replaced by a patchwork of loyalties and rivalries. Economically, the Chola heartland remained prosperous thanks to the fertility of the Kaveri Delta and the resilience of village assemblies, but the revenues that had once flowed from distant provinces and overseas trade diminished. The decline of maritime supremacy meant that Tamil merchants no longer commanded the same influence in Southeast Asia. The ports of the Coromandel coast continued to trade, but the days of Chola fleets projecting power to Sumatra and China were long past. The narrowing of economic horizons contributed to the erosion of royal power, as kings lacked the resources to sustain large armies or fund monumental projects on the scale of their predecessors. Symbolically, too, the Cholas lost ground. Temples that had once proclaimed imperial grandeur continued to function, but new construction slowed, and the great projects of the earlier Golden Age were not repeated. Patronage shifted toward the Pandyas and Hoysalas, whose rulers now commissioned temples and bronzes that rivaled or surpassed those of the Cholas. The cultural leadership that had been central to Chola identity was slipping away, leaving the dynasty without the same aura of inevitability it had once possessed. The final blows came in the later 13th century. The Pandyas, under rulers such as Maravarman Kulasekara Pandya, launched campaigns that reduced the Cholas to vassal status. By the 1270s and 1280s, the Chola kings retained only limited authority in parts of the Kaveri Delta, acknowledging Pandya overlordship. In some accounts, the last Chola rulers are described as little more than titular monarchs, their real power eclipsed by their more dynamic rivals. The empire that had once commanded respect from China to Arabia was now reduced to a rump kingdom, its rulers struggling to maintain even symbolic independence. The final end of the Cholas came in the early 14th century, when the Pandyas absorbed their remaining territories and the rising tide of northern invasions reshaped the political map of South India. The incursion of the Delhi Sultanate into the south in the 14th century dealt heavy blows to both Pandyas and Hoysalas, but by then the Cholas had already disappeared as a political force. Their dynasty had lasted for centuries, outliving many rivals, but its time had finally passed. The fall of the Cholas in the 13th century was thus the product of both internal and external forces. Internally, succession disputes, weakened authority, and economic contraction eroded their capacity to rule. Externally, the resurgence of the Pandyas and the ambitions of the Hoysalas steadily reduced their power. Together, these factors created a situation in which the once mighty Chola Empire could no longer sustain itself. The dynasty did not collapse in a single catastrophic moment, but dwindled over decades, fading from dominance into irrelevance. Yet even as their political power crumbled, the Cholas left behind a legacy that endured. the temples of Thanjavur and Gangaikonda Cholapuram still stood, proclaiming the glory of an age when Tamil kings had ruled the seas. The bronzes still danced in temple processions, embodying divine grace. The hymns of the Bhakti saints continued to echo through Tamil country, preserved and institutionalized by Chola patronage. The administrative structures they built, village assemblies, temple-based governance, systems of revenue and irrigation, outlived the dynasty itself, shaping South Indian society for centuries. The fall of the Cholas, therefore, was not the end of their story, but the closing of a chapter. Their empire had risen, expanded, consolidated, and declined, following a rhythm familiar in history. But the cultural, economic, and institutional legacies of the Chola age endured, influencing the Pandya resurgence, the Vijayanagara Empire, and the Tamil identity itself. The 13th century witnessed the political end of the Cholas, but their presence lived on, etched in stone, bronze, and memory, a reminder that even in decline, the Cholas remained one of the great dynasties of India's past. The Chola dynasty may have fallen as a political power by the 14th century, but its legacy continued to radiate across South Asia and far beyond, shaping cultural, economic, and artistic traditions for centuries. Few dynasties in Indian history left behind a presence so tangible, etched into stone temples, cast in bronze images, inscribed in meticulous records, and carried overseas in trade and cultural exchange. The Cholas were remembered not simply as rulers of a medieval empire, but as architects of a civilization whose influence reached across the Indian Ocean, whose artistic achievements came to define Tamil identity, and whose administrative innovations endured long after their political decline. One of the most visible aspects of the Chola legacy is the monumental architecture they left behind. The great temples of Rajarajathariam and Rajendra remain among the crowning achievements of Indian architecture. The Brihadeeswarar Temple at Thanjavur with its soaring vimana continues to dominate the landscape more than a millennium after it was built. The temple at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, constructed to commemorate Rajendra's Ganga campaign, still stands as a symbol of imperial ambition translated into stone. These temples were not only centres of worship, but also cultural and administrative hubs, their walls covered with inscriptions that preserve the details of Chola governance, economy and society, together with countless smaller temples built or endowed during Chola rule. They form a living archive of the dynasty's impact, still active in ritual life and still central to Tamil culture. Equally enduring is the legacy of Chola bronze sculpture. The images of Shiva as Nataraja, of Parvati, of Vishnu and countless other deities created during the Chola age are widely regarded as masterpieces of world art. Cast using the lost wax technique, they combine technical mastery with an elegance that captures both the physical and the spiritual. These bronzes were created as living icons, carried in processions and worshipped in temples, but over time they also became emblems of Tamil culture itself. Today they are housed in museums across the world, from London to New York to Chennai, where they continue to inspire awe. The fact that Chola bronzes remain the most recognisable icons of Indian art attests to the dynasty's enduring cultural power. The Cholas also left a profound mark on literature and religion. By patronising the Bhakti tradition, they ensured that the hymns of the Nayanmars and Alvas were canonised and institutionalised within temple rituals. The daily recitation of the Tevaram in Shaiva temples, a practice that continues today, owes much to Chola patronage. At the same time, Tamil literary production flourished, with works that blended devotion, epic, and courtly themes. The Cholas thus helped shape the canon of Tamil literature, embedding devotion and cultural pride in texts that outlasted the dynasty itself. In administration, the Cholas pioneered forms of governance that influenced South Indian society for centuries. Their system of local self-government through village assemblies, recorded in temple inscriptions, became a model of decentralised administration. The Sabhas and Yuva councils managed irrigation, resolved disputes, and collected taxes, while temples acted as repositories of records and wealth. Even after the fall of the dynasty, these institutions persisted, influencing the structures adopted by the Pandyas, Vijayanagara rulers, and even colonial administrators in later centuries. The Chola emphasis on written records, carved into stone and copper plates, left a treasure trove for historians and a precedent for bureaucratic continuity. The Cholas also reshaped the Indian Ocean world. Their naval expeditions to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, their campaigns against Srivijaya, and their merchant guilds established abroad created patterns of exchange that endured. Tamil merchant communities in places like Sumatra, Malaysia and Thailand carried with them their language, religion and art. Inscriptions in Tamil have been found in Southeast Asia, evidence of these overseas communities. Temples supported by Tamil merchants appeared abroad, spreading Chola-influenced architecture and iconography. While Indian cultural influence in Southeast Asia predated the Cholas, their military and commercial assertiveness gave it new force and direction. They were not passive transmitters, but active participants in shaping a transoceanic cultural zone. Diplomatically, the Cholas established relations with powers as distant as China. Embassies to the Song court in the 11th century testify to their recognition as a world power. These embassies secured trade privileges for Tamil merchants and placed the Cholas on the map of global diplomacy. For a dynasty based in the Kaveri Delta to be acknowledged at the Chinese court was a remarkable achievement, reflecting the interconnectedness of the medieval world and the Cholas' ability to participate in it. The Chola legacy is also evident in the way later dynasties remembered and emulated them. The Pandyas, Hoysalas, and Vijayanagara rulers all drew upon Chola precedents in temple building, administration, and patronage of literature. The Vijayanagara kings in particular adopted the model of monumental temple-centered capitals that the Cholas had pioneered. Even as political control shifted, the memory of the Cholas as the archetypal Tamil Empire persisted. In Tamil identity, the Cholas occupy a place of pride that has never diminished. They are remembered as rulers who combined military power with cultural brilliance, who built temples that remained central to religious life, who patronized poets and sculptors whose work still define Tamil art, and who sent ships across the seas to project Tamil influence abroad. In the modern era, when Tamil identity has been reasserted in various forms, the Cholas are invoked as a symbol of a glorious past, a reminder of Tamil strength and creativity on a global stage. Even beyond Tamilakam, the Chola legacy is visible. In Sri Lanka, their rule left architectural and artistic traces, as well as a long history of interaction, sometimes violent, sometimes cultural, between the island and the Tamil country. In Southeast Asia, the memory of Chola incursions blended with the enduring presence of Tamil merchant communities, shaping local traditions. In the wider world, the Cholas contributed to the story of medieval globalization, demonstrating how a regional dynasty could become a global actor through trade, diplomacy, and naval power. Ultimately, the Cholas' most enduring contribution lies in the synthesis they achieved. They combined devotion and empire, art and administration, local assemblies and global diplomacy, temples and ships, into a coherent vision of civilization. They demonstrated that Tamil culture could not only flourish at home but also radiate abroad, that a dynasty rooted in the Kaveri Delta could shape the currents of the Indian Ocean, and that political power could be immortalized in stone, bronze, and verse. The fall of the Cholas in the 13th century closed their political story, but their legacy continued to live on in countless forms. Their temples still rise above the plains of Tamil Nadu, their bronzes still dance in the hands of priests, their hymns still echo in rituals, and their memory still inspires pride. Across South Asia and beyond, the Cholas left an imprint that no conquest or decline could erase. They remain one of the greatest dynasties of Indian history, a symbol of the heights Tamil civilization reached, and a reminder of how deeply interconnected the medieval world already was.